Clara Whitmore did not cry when they pushed her off the train platform. She didn't make a sound when her suitcase split open in the mud, and every last thing she owned scattered across the dirt, while the men of Broken Spur, Montana, stood in a circle and laughed. She just knelt down in that ruined blue dress, the same dress she'd worn to her father's funeral 3 weeks before, picked up every single piece, and stood back up straighter than she'd arrived. Nobody clapped. Nobody helped. But one man watched from the shadows and said nothing. His name was Elias Carter, and everything was about to change. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The letter had said she was strong. That was the word the agency used. Strong. Experienced with animals, familiar with hard work, capable of surviving frontier life. Elias Carter had read that letter 4 times in the 2 weeks before she arrived. He'd read it the way a drowning man reads a map. Desperate, searching for something solid to hold on to. His ranch was bleeding money. His cattle count had dropped by 1/3 since the previous winter. His nearest neighbor, old Pete Hargrove, had sold his land 3 months ago and moved his family to Billings without even saying goodbye. And Victor Langley's men had been riding the fence lines twice a week, smiling like wolves every time they passed. Elias needed help. He did not need what stepped off that train. She was slight. Not fragile exactly, but slight. The kind of woman who looked like she'd never carried anything heavier than a hatbox. Her dress was the color of a winter sky, faded at the elbows, mended twice at the collar. Her hair was pinned back too neatly for a woman coming off 3 days of hard rail travel. Her hands, he noticed her hands immediately, the way he always noticed hands on the ranch, were soft, uncalloused, clean in a way that told him everything he feared. She looked around the platform, looked at the mud, looked at the men who were already laughing. Then her suitcase hit the ground and split open. A tin cup, a hairbrush, a folded piece of paper, probably a letter, a worn book with the spine broken, a small photograph in a cracked frame. Everything she had in the world, rolling in the dirt while men in good boots stepped back to avoid getting splashed and went right on laughing. She knelt down without a word. Elias watched her from where he stood at the far end of the platform, hat in hand, saying nothing. A part of him, the decent part, his mother would have said, wanted to step forward, to help, to silence the laughter with one look the way he knew he could. He didn't move. Because if she couldn't handle a broken suitcase and a crowd of idiots on a train platform, she was never going to survive a Montana winter. Better to know that now, here, in front of everyone, than to find out in February when the temperature dropped to 30 below and the cattle needed saving before dawn. She collected every single item, folded the dress back, pressed the photograph against her chest for just a moment, just one breath's worth, before placing it carefully on top of everything else. Then she stood up. She didn't look at the men who'd laughed. She looked directly at him. "Mr. Carter," she said. Not a question, not an introduction, just a statement of fact, the way you'd name a mountain or a river. Something that already existed and didn't require explanation. "Miss Whitmore," he said back. She walked toward him with that broken suitcase held together by both arms and stopped 2 feet away, close enough for him to see that her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She had been crying recently. She was not crying now. "I expect you're disappointed," she said. "I expect you're tired," he said, which wasn't an answer. "I am," she said. "But I didn't come here to rest." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on, picked up her suitcase, because no matter what he thought of the situation, his mother had raised him better than that, and walked toward the wagon. "It's 4 hours to the ranch," he said. "Road's rough." "I'm sure it is," she said, and followed him. Behind them, the laughter faded, but the damage was already done. By sundown, everyone in Broken Spur would know the story. By morning, Victor Langley would know it too. And by the end of the week, the version that traveled through the saloons and the general store and the bank would be the version Langley wanted. That Elias Carter had finally gotten desperate enough to marry a useless city woman who couldn't even hold her suitcase together. Elias didn't know that yet. He was too busy trying to figure out what to say to the woman sitting 3 feet away from him on the wagon bench, spine straight, hands folded, watching the road like she was memorizing it. "You got family?" he asked. Conversation felt wrong, but silence felt worse. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He didn't push it. They rode the rest of the way in quiet. The cabin was worse than she'd imagined. Clara had imagined bad. She had prepared herself for bad. She had sat on that train for 3 days, telling herself that whatever she found at the end of this journey would be manageable, would be survivable, would be better than the alternative, which was staying in St. Louis in a rented room she could no longer afford, waiting for Victor Langley's lawyers to finish the work of taking the last of what her father had left behind. The cabin was worse than bad. One main room, a hearth that smoked, a table with 3 legs and a 4th that had been repaired with rope. 2 windows, one of which had been covered with oilskin instead of glass. A sleeping loft with a ladder that had a broken rung. Outside, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, 2 corrals in need of repair, and a fence line she could see from the door that had gaps in it wide enough to walk a horse through. She stood in the doorway and took it all in. Elias stood behind her, holding her suitcase, waiting. "The loft is yours," he said. "I sleep down here." "All right," she said. "There's water at the stream. Firewood's behind the barn. Chickens are yours to manage starting tomorrow. I need help with the morning feeding before first light." "What time is first light?" "This time of year? About 5. "I'll be up at 4:30, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, not approval. More like recalibration, like a man who had done a sum and gotten an answer he hadn't expected. "You'll need boots," he said, looking at her shoes. City shoes. Leather, with small heels. "Those won't last a week." "Do you have a spare pair?" "Not your size." "Then they'll have to do until I can arrange otherwise." She stepped inside, set her repaired suitcase on the table, and looked around the room with the same careful attention she'd given the road. The window needs glass before winter. The fence line on the south side needs repair before you lose any more cattle through it. And the hearth. The flue is partially blocked, which is why it smokes. If you have a long iron rod and 2 hours, I can clear it. Elias stared at her. "How do you know about flues?" "My father's company built furnaces," she said simply. "I grew up watching men fix things that were broken. I paid attention." He was quiet for a moment. "You said your father's company," he said. Past tense. Clara's hand stilled on the suitcase clasp, just for a moment. Then she opened it and began removing her things. "Past tense," she confirmed, and said nothing more. She learned the difference between a working ranch and a dying one within the first 3 days. A working ranch had rhythm. Animals fed on a schedule, fences checked on a rotation, water sources monitored before problems became emergencies. Everything moved in a pattern, and the pattern was what kept chaos from taking over. Elias Carter's ranch had no rhythm. It had desperation. He worked from before dawn until after dark, doing the work of 3 men alone, fixing problems as they exploded instead of preventing them from exploding in the first place. The fence on the south side had been broken for 2 weeks. One of the water troughs had a slow leak that was wasting water every day. The grain storage had a moisture problem that was going to cost him badly come spring. Clara saw all of it in 3 days. On the 4th day, she started fixing things. She didn't ask permission. That was the part that surprised Elias most. Not that she was doing the work, but that she simply began, the way you'd begin breathing. Without ceremony, without announcement, without any apparent expectation of being noticed. He noticed. The first morning he came back from the north pasture to find the smoke gone from the chimney. Actually gone, not just diminished but genuinely gone. He stood in the yard for a full minute staring at the roof. "Flue's clear," Clara said from behind him. She was carrying a bucket. "I found the iron rod in the barn. I've been meaning to get to that for 3 months." "I know," she said, and walked past him toward the trough. He turned and watched her go. She was wearing his old work jacket. He'd left it on the porch hook 3 days ago without comment. which was the closest he could manage to, "You'll need this. It gets cold." And her city shoes, which were already showing damage from the terrain, but which she wore with complete indifference to their destruction. Her hair was loose today, instead of pinned, and it occurred to him that she looked less like a city woman and more like something else. Something he didn't quite have a word for yet. "Miss Whitmore," he called. She stopped, turned. "The trough leak," he said. "You'll need the tar bucket from inside the barn. Left wall, near the door." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And she sounded like she meant it. Not the polite thank you of a woman being gracious, but the real kind. The kind that meant I was going to find it eventually, and I appreciate that you just saved me 20 minutes. He turned back to his work before she could see whatever was happening in his expression. The first time someone from town came by the ranch, Clara was up to her elbows in fence repair. She'd figured out the wire by trial and error, cutting her hands twice before getting the tension right, and she was so focused on the section she was reinforcing that she didn't hear the horse until it was almost at the fence line. 2 men. She recognized one of them. She'd seen him at the general store in town 2 days ago when Elias had taken her in to get supplies. His name was Dobb, she thought, or something like it. He worked for someone. She'd noted the way other men stepped back when he walked in, and she'd filed that information away without comment. He looked at her now the way men looked at problems they were enjoying. "Well now," he said, leaning on his saddle horn. "That the new Mrs. Carter?" "I'm not Mrs. Carter," Clara said, without looking up from the wire. "Not yet." He looked at his companion, back at her. "Elias know you're out here tearing up his fence?" "Elias knows I'm out here fixing his fence," she said. "There's a difference." "You look like a woman who doesn't know the difference between fixing and making things worse." Clara tied off the wire, stood up, looked at him directly. "And you look like a man who's ridden out here for a reason that has nothing to do with the fence," she said. "What do you actually want?" The smile on his face thinned slightly. He wasn't used to that. She could see it. He was used to people being polite, hedging, uncertain. He was used to being the one who set the tone. "Just being neighborly," he said. "Neighborly," she repeated. "Mr. Langley send you?" The name hit something in his face. Not guilt. Men like this didn't do guilt, but surprise. She'd named the thing too directly, too fast. He hadn't expected her to know the name. "I don't know what you think you know, miss," he said, and his voice had changed. Less friendly now, more careful. "I know enough," Clara said. "Tell him she's not what he expected. He should plan accordingly." She picked up her wire cutters and went back to the fence. The men rode away without another word. Her hands were shaking, she realized. Not from fear, from anger. The specific, controlled, very dangerous kind of anger she'd been carrying since the day she sat in a lawyer's office in St. Louis and listened to a man explain that Victor Langley had purchased her father's remaining debts and there was nothing left. Nothing at all. She pressed her hands flat against the fence post until they steadied. Then she kept working. It was Elias who finally asked the question directly, on the 8th night. They'd fallen into a kind of routine by then. Him coming in from the last evening check, her having something on the hearth that passed for supper, the two of them eating in the kind of silence that had started as uncomfortable and was slowly, reluctantly, becoming something else. He sat down across from her, looked at the plate she'd set in front of him, and said, "Victor Langley destroyed your father's company." Clara looked up. "His men came by the south fence today," Elias said. "The fact that you knew who they worked for the second they rode up tells me you didn't come here accidentally." "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," Clara said. "That's not the same as an accident." "Did you know it was Langley's territory when you signed with the agency?" A pause. She was honest by nature. She'd tried to be otherwise and found she wasn't built for it. "Yes," she said. Elias put down his fork. "Clara." He hadn't used her given name before, she noticed. "What exactly are you planning?" "I'm planning to help you save this ranch," she said. "That's what I agreed to do." "And Langley?" She met his eyes across the table. "Victor Langley ruined my father," she said. My father worked 30 years to build something honest and good, and Langley tore it down in 8 months because he wanted the contracts. He didn't even need them. He just didn't want anyone else to have them. She paused. My father died 6 weeks after the company failed. The doctor said it was his heart. I know better. The room was very quiet. So yes, she said. I knew whose territory this was. And yes, I came here anyway. Because this is where he's vulnerable. Right here, on this land, with this ranch, with the water rights attached to it, that he can't get his hands on as long as you hold the claim. She held his gaze. I'm not using you, Mr. Carter. I'm offering you an alliance. There's a difference. Elias sat back in his chair and looked at her for a long time. You're not what I expected, he said finally. No, Clara agreed. I'm not. Langley's dangerous, he said. He doesn't just ruin businesses, he ruins people. I know. You're not afraid of that? She thought about her father, about the look on his face the last time she'd seen him. Not defeated exactly, but hollowed out, like something essential had been removed. I'm terrified, she said. But I've already lost everything once. That changes what you're willing to risk. Elias picked his fork back up. He didn't speak again for a while. But when he finished eating, he said, The south fence still has 2 weak sections. I'll show you in the morning where the wire is stored. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't acceptance. But it was something. Victor Langley heard about the woman on the train platform by sundown of the first day, just as Elias had suspected he would. He heard about the broken suitcase, about the city shoes, about the way she'd looked stepping off the train, thin, worn, carrying nothing of consequence. His man Dobb reported back 3 days later. She'd been fixing fence, knew the name, wasn't rattled. Langley sat at the desk in his office, a real desk, mahogany, shipped from back east, the kind of desk that communicated power to everyone who walked through the door, and thought about what this information meant. He'd arranged Clara's placement himself. He had a man at the agency, a useful arrangement that had served him well before. When Elias Carter's land claim situation had come to his attention and he'd begun looking for pressure points, the mail order agency had been an obvious tool. A useless wife would drain resources, would undermine morale, would give the courts, should it come to courts, a narrative about a struggling, unstable homestead. He had specifically selected Clara Whitmore because she looked perfect on paper. A businessman's daughter, education, refinement, no frontier experience whatsoever, no physical resilience, no practical skills. She should have been exactly what he needed her to be. She's not going to leave, Dobb said. No, Langley agreed. She's not. He was quiet for a moment. Find out what she knows, he said. About the company, about the documents. You think she has something? Langley looked out the window at the main street of Broken Spur. The street he'd built, essentially, with his investments and his loans and his very deliberate cultivation of every business in town. Her father was a careful man, he said. Too careful. There were papers I never recovered. He paused. I want to know if she brought them with her. And if she did? Langley turned back to his desk. Then we don't wait for winter to fix this problem, he said. We fix it now. Tug. Clara didn't tell Elias about the papers. Not yet. She had them, folded small, pressed between the pages of the broken-spined book in her suitcase, wrapped in oilskin to protect them from moisture. Her father had given them to her on one of the last good days, when he still had clarity enough to know what mattered. Keep these, he'd said. Don't let them see you have them. Don't bring them out until you're somewhere safe, and the moment is exactly right. She didn't know if this ranch was safe yet. She didn't know if she'd ever find exactly the right moment. But she knew one thing. Victor Langley was looking for these papers. Had been looking for them since before her father died. The fact that he hadn't found them meant he didn't know she had them. She intended to keep it that way until she knew precisely what she was going to do. In the meantime, she fixed fences. She learned to read cattle the way Elias did, watching their movements, noting which animals were off their feed, understanding what it meant when they bunched together in the northeast corner of the pasture versus the southwest. She asked questions constantly, unself-consciously, with the same practical hunger she brought to everything. Elias answered them. Stopped being surprised that she asked. Started sometimes pointing things out before she had to ask, which she suspected he didn't fully realize he was doing. The cabin was warmer since she'd cleared the flue. The trough had stopped leaking. The fence lines were tighter. Small things. But small things added up. And somewhere beneath all of it, in the steady accumulation of cold mornings and hard work, and gradually, reluctantly shared meals, something was beginning to shift between the mountain man who had expected to be ruined and the woman they'd sent to ruin him. Neither of them named it. Neither of them was ready to. But the Montana mountains were old and patient, and they had seen this kind of thing before. Two people standing in the ruins of everything they'd lost, discovering that they were not, in fact, alone. The winter was coming, and everything was about to get harder before it got better. But Clara Whitmore had already buried her father, survived her own destruction, and ridden 4 hours in silence next to a man who didn't want her on a road she didn't know to a life she'd never lived. She was still here. She was not leaving. And Victor Langley, sitting behind his mahogany desk in Broken Spur, had just made the worst mistake of his life. He had underestimated her, and she intended to make absolutely certain he never recovered from it. The snow hadn't come yet, but you could smell it. Clara had learned that in the 3 weeks she'd been on the ranch, the way the air changed before a storm, sharpening at the edges, carrying something cold and metallic that settled in the back of your throat. She'd learned it the same way she'd learned everything else out here, by paying attention when nobody was teaching her. Elias was already gone when she climbed down from the loft that morning. His bedroll was folded, his coffee cup rinsed and turned upside down on the table, the only domestic gesture she'd ever seen from him. And the barn door was open, which meant he'd taken the gray mare out before first light. She didn't know where. She'd stopped asking after the first week, when she'd figured out that his movements weren't secretive so much as solitary. He simply didn't think to account for another person knowing where he was. She was working on changing that. She built the fire, put the water on, and went out to feed the chickens. The rooster, a bad-tempered animal she had privately named Victor, which helped, tried to take a piece out of her ankle, and she sidestepped him without breaking stride. Small victories. She was collecting them like coins. The sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground brought her head up fast. Not Elias. Wrong rhythm. 2 horses, coming from the direction of town, moving with that particular unhurried confidence that meant whoever was riding them wasn't worried about being unwelcome. She recognized the man in front before he was close enough to speak. Dob. He'd been by twice in the last 10 days. Never for long, never with a reason that held up to examination. He was Langley's measure of her, she understood. His way of taking her temperature without getting close enough to burn. The second man she hadn't seen before. Heavier, older, with a badge on his coat that caught the pale morning light. She stood her ground in the yard and waited. "Morning, miss," Dob said, pulling up with that particular smile she'd decided she hated more than almost anything. "This here's Deputy Marshal Horace Briggs. Rode out from Broken Spur to have a word with Mr. Carter." "Mr. Carter isn't here," Clara said. "What kind of word?" Briggs looked at her with the mild, assessing expression of a man who'd spent a career deciding how much trouble a person was going to cause him. "Just a courtesy call, ma'am. There's been a complaint filed about the fence line on the eastern boundary. Claim it's been moved." Clara kept her face completely still. "Moved by whom?" "That's what we're looking into," Briggs said. Polite, patient, utterly unconvincing. "The eastern fence line is exactly where it was when Elias Carter filed his land claim," she said. "I can show you the original survey documentation if you'd like. I've been reviewing the ranch records." Something moved through Dobbs' expression. Fast, but she caught it. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected confusion, or deference, or the kind of anxious helpfulness that would let him talk around her. "That's real cooperative of you, miss," he said, recovering. "Though a complaint like this really ought to be discussed with the landowner." "Then you can come back when he's here," Clara said. "Or I can send word to Elias right now and ask him to ride back early. Your choice. But either way, I'll have those survey records ready to look at, And I'd suggest bringing someone who actually knows what they're looking at, because the numbers are going to be very clear. Briggs looked at Dobb. Dobb looked at Clara. "We'll come back," Briggs said. "I'll have coffee on," she said, and walked back to the cabin without watching them leave. Inside, she sat down at the table and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed. The fence line complaint was fabricated. She knew it before Briggs finished his first sentence. It was a legal tool, a way to start building a record, to create the appearance of a dispute that could be escalated later. She'd watched Langley do the exact same thing to her father's company, one small manufactured grievance at a time, until the mountain of paper was tall enough to bury a man under. She was not going to let that happen here. She pulled out the ranch ledger from the shelf where she'd found it on her third day, stuffed behind a broken harness and clearly untouched for months, and opened it to the last page she'd been working on. Numbers. Real numbers, clear and honest, the language she'd grown up speaking in her father's office. She'd been rebuilding the financial picture of the ranch from scattered receipts and half-kept records, and what she was finding was both worse and better than expected. Worse, the debt was significant. Not ruinous yet, but significant. Langley held a note through the bank that came due in the spring, and if the cattle sales didn't cover it, the bank would have legal standing to begin foreclosure proceedings. Better, there was a route out. Narrow, requiring everything to go right, but a route. She was still working through the numbers when she heard the gray mare in the yard. She didn't look up when Elias came through the door. "Two men came by," she said. "Dobb and a deputy marshal named Briggs. Filed a complaint about the eastern fence line. It's a pressure tactic. They're starting to build a paper record." A pause. The sound of him hanging up his coat. "I know Briggs," Elias said. "He's Langley's, has been for years. I told them I had the original survey documentation. Do you?" "Should be in the land office box." A moment. "Bottom shelf, behind the broken harness. Yes, I found the ledger there too." She finally looked up. "We need to go through everything in that box today. Every document, every record. I need to know exactly what we have before they come back." Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the ledger, at the numbers she'd been working on, at the neat columns she'd reconstructed from his scattered records. His expression did something complicated that she'd been watching him do more frequently. Some internal reckoning happening that he didn't put words to. "You've been doing the books," he said. "Someone had to." "I wasn't." He stopped, started again. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," she agreed. "But the note Langley holds through the bank comes due in March, and if you don't know exactly where you stand, you can't make a plan. So." She turned the ledger toward him. "Here's where you stand." He looked at the numbers for a long time. She watched him work through them. She'd gotten better at reading his face, better than she'd expected to, better than she suspected he was comfortable with. He was a man who kept himself very contained, not from coldness exactly, but from habit, the way you kept a fire banked when you couldn't afford to waste heat. But the numbers hit him somewhere unguarded. She could see it. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "It's survivable," she said. "But only if we move fast and do it right. The spring cattle sale has to be bigger than last year. Significantly bigger. That means we need to know which animals are worth keeping for breeding versus selling. We need to start networking with buyers before winter closes the roads, and we need to have the legal documents tight enough that any manufactured complaint gets thrown out before it gains traction." He looked up from the ledger. "You've been thinking about this a while," he said. "Since day 4, she said. "When I saw the grain storage problem and started understanding the pattern of everything else." She held his gaze. "Elias, I know you didn't want a partner. I know I'm not what you asked for. But you have a land claim that Langley desperately wants, documents that could protect it or lose it, and a debt timeline that doesn't allow for slowness. So either we do this together, both of us, or we don't do it at all." I was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to push back, to reassert something about the way things were supposed to be, the way a man was supposed to manage his own affairs. She'd been waiting for it, the moment he hit the wall of his own pride and stopped. He didn't. "What do you need from me?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Something in her chest loosened that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. "Tell me everything about the eastern boundary," she said. "Every post, every marker, every time anyone has questioned it. Start from the beginning." He did. It took 2 hours. She wrote down everything he said. Outside, the smell of snow got sharper. And Victor Langley, sitting in his office in town, told Dobb to start moving faster. He'd seen the way she'd stood in that yard, the way she'd named the game before the play was finished. Women like that were dangerous not because they were loud, but because they were organized. And organized was the thing he'd never been able to buy, bully, or wait out. "Start the fence complaint moving through Briggs," he said, "and find out who she's been writing letters to, because she's been writing letters to someone." He was right. She had been. He just didn't know yet who was on the other end. The letter had gone out in the first week, tucked inside a grocery order from the general store. She'd made friends with the store owner's wife, a quiet, observant woman named Ruth Hendricks, and Ruth had agreed to post letters for her without comment in exchange for Clara's help with the store's accounts, which were nearly as chaotic as Elias's ranch records. Clara had written to a man named George Aldrin, a land attorney she'd known through her father's business. He was old and cautious and thorough, and he practiced in Helena, far enough from Langley's immediate reach to be trusted. The letter explained the situation in plain terms. The land claim, the debt note, the fence complaint, Victor Langley's name, written out clearly, without hesitation. She asked for 2 things: an assessment of what legal grounds Langley might use against the ranch, and information about whether any of the documents she'd brought from St. Louis had legal standing in a Montana court. She'd been waiting for the response for 2 weeks. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the supply wagon, slipped to her by Ruth Hendricks with a small nod and no words. She read it in the barn, sitting on a hay bale with the horses breathing warmly around her, because it was the one place on the ranch where she was genuinely alone. Aldrin's response was 4 pages. She read it twice. The news was complicated, mixed in a way that made her hold very still and think carefully before she felt anything about it. The good, 2 of the documents she'd described, the ones her father had pressed into her hands in his last clear days, had potential legal weight. They were records of transactions conducted between Langley's company and her father's company that could constitute evidence of fraud if brought before the right court. Aldrin wanted to see them. He was careful about his phrasing, very careful. But beneath the lawyerly hedging, she could read his excitement. The bad. Building a fraud case would take time. Months at minimum, possibly over a year. And it would require Clara to be present, stable, credible. Which meant it would require the ranch to still be standing when the moment came. The complicated. Aldrin had added a postscript in his own handwriting, different ink from the body of the letter. "I knew your father. He spoke of you often. He was very proud. Be careful, Clara. This man does not play by any rules you can predict." She folded the letter carefully and put it inside her dress, against her ribs. Then she sat with it for a while, in the warm quiet of the barn, listening to the horses. Her father had been proud of her. She had not known that, not in words, not like that. It was a small thing and a massive thing at the same time, and she let herself feel it for exactly 60 seconds. The grief and the gratitude, and the particular ache of being told something too late by someone who could no longer say it himself. Then she stood up, brushed the hay from her dress, and went back to the cabin. Elias was mending a harness at the table. He looked up when she came in. He'd gotten better at reading her too, she'd noticed. Not in any obvious way. He wasn't the kind of man who announced his observations, but he noticed things. The way she carried herself when she'd had news she was processing. The difference between her quiet and her silence. "Good news or bad?" he said. "Both," she said. She sat down across from him. "I need to tell you something." He put the harness down. She told him about the letter, about Aldrin, about the documents she had, still folded in oilskin in her suitcase upstairs. About what they potentially meant. She watched his face move through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, then something sharper, then a kind of stillness that was different from his usual containment. "You've been holding those documents for how long?" he said. "Since before I came here." "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't know if I could trust you," she said plainly. "I'd lost everything to a man my father trusted. I wasn't going to make the same mistake twice." His jaw moved. She could see him weighing that. Irritation against understanding. The instinct to be offended against the ability to recognize, if he was honest, that he'd been doing the same thing. Not trusting her. Waiting. Watching. "Do you trust me now?" he said. Not accusatory, a real question. She thought about it honestly. "Enough," she said. "Enough to tell you this." He was quiet. "If Langley finds out you have those papers," he said, "this stops being a fence complaint." "I know. He'll come at us directly." "I know that too." Clara. He said her name the way he had that first night. Different from Miss Whitmore. Different from how he said it to the horses, or the land, or the equipment. Like she was specifically a person he was specifically talking to. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm trying to do what my father couldn't," she said. He had the evidence. He had the case. But he was alone, and by the time he understood what Langley was doing, it was too late, and he was already too broken to fight. She paused. "I'm not going to be too late, and I'm not going to be alone." She held his eyes. "If you're willing to fight this with me." The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Just a few flakes, barely enough to notice, but it was starting. "Where are the documents?" he said. "Upstairs, in the suitcase." He nodded slowly. "Then we'd better figure out how to keep them safe," he said. "Because if Langley's running a fence complaint, the next thing he tries will be a search." She hadn't thought of that yet. She'd thought of several things, but not that. "He can do that?" she said. "He's got Briggs," Elias said, "and half the county court. Yeah, he can manufacture a reason for a search if he wants one." She stood up, crossed to the hearth, stood with her back to the fire and her hands clasped, and thought very fast. "The documents can't stay here," she said. "No. Aldrin needs copies. The originals need to be somewhere Langley can't reach them." "Helena," Elias said. "That's where Aldrin is?" "Yes, I can get someone to Helena," he said. "Takes 4 days each way in good weather, less if they push." "Who do you trust enough for that ride?" He thought about it. "Pete Hargrove," he said. "Before he moved to Billings. He owes me. And he's got no connection to Langley anymore. He's out of the territory." "Can you reach him?" "I can try." He paused. "Clara, the minute those documents are in Aldrin's hands, this becomes a legal matter that Langley is going to hear about. There's no walking it back after that." "I know. We'll be committed." "I know." He looked at her across the cabin. Snow against the window, barely audible. Fire at her back. "All right," he said. 2 words. Flat, certain, without drama. She felt something shift so fundamentally in her chest that it took her a moment to recognize it. She had not felt safe since her father died. Not once, not in any room, not with any person. She'd been functioning, efficiently, effectively, at a pace that left no room for anything else. But she had not felt safe. She felt it now. Just a thread of it, barely there. She turned back to the fire before he could see her expression. "I'll copy the documents tonight," she said. "We can get the originals ready to send by morning." "I'll write to Pete," he said. They worked for the rest of the evening in a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of 2 strangers enduring each other. Not even the working quiet of 2 people tolerating a shared space, but something closer. Something that had a shape to it. The snow fell outside and kept falling. 3 days later, Dobb came back. This time, without Briggs. He came alone, which was worse. Elias was in the barn when Dobb rode into the yard. Clara was at the water trough, and she saw Dobb's expression as he dismounted. Saw that the affable, smiling quality was gone, replaced by something more direct, more purposeful. And understood immediately that this wasn't a courtesy call. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'll come straight to it." "Please," she said. Mr. Langley has it on good information that you're in possession of documents belonging to his company. Documents that were removed from St. Louis without his knowledge. She looked at him with an expression of mild, polite confusion that she had practiced and refined into an art form. I'm not sure what information Mr. Langley has, she said, but I haven't removed anything belonging to anyone. I arrived here with my personal effects and nothing else. We'd like to verify that, Dobbs said, directly. Then Mr. Langley is welcome to speak to my attorney, she said. The shift on his face was immediate. Attorney was a word that changed the calculation, and he knew it. You've got an attorney, he said flatly. I have representation in Helena, she said. George Aldrin, if Mr. Langley wants to direct his inquiry appropriately. The originals had left the ranch 2 days ago, carried by a man Elias trusted, riding for Helena. Clara had the copies hidden. Not in the cabin, not in the barn, but in a place she and Elias had agreed on, somewhere a search wouldn't find without specific knowledge of where to look. Dobb looked at her for a long moment. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. I'm making it exactly as hard as it legally should be, she said. He got back on his horse. She watched him go and kept her breathing measured, and even until he was completely out of sight. Then she leaned against the trough and let herself shake for about 10 seconds. That was either very smart or very dangerous, Elias said from the barn door. He'd heard it all. Both, she said. Definitely both. He came and stood next to her, looking at the empty road where Dobb had disappeared. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. He'll go back and report, Elias said. Yes. And Langley's going to realize the documents are already out of reach. Yes. That's when things get ugly. I know. She straightened up, stopped shaking. Elias, do you have any neighbors who aren't afraid of Langley? Anyone at all? He thought about it. One, he said slowly. Maybe. Widow named Hester Crane. She's got a place 8 miles east. Langley's tried to buy her out twice and she told him to go to hell both times. Is she well regarded? She's the kind of woman people respect because she doesn't bend. Could you introduce me to her? He looked at her sideways. Why? Because I need to know if she'd be willing to testify, Clara said, about Langley's methods, about what he's done to the people around here. And because one woman standing alone against a man like Langley is dangerous. But if there are 2 of us, and behind us there are others. She stopped. Let him finish the thought himself. He did. You want to build a coalition, he said slowly. I want to build a case, she said. The legal documents are the foundation, but a case needs witnesses, corroboration, people who can speak to pattern and practice. She paused. Langley is powerful because everyone around here is fighting him alone. If they started fighting him together... He's got the bank, Elias said. He holds notes on half the farms in the county. If people go against him, he calls those notes. I know. It could ruin them. I know that too. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking people to take a risk. I'm not taking myself. I'm already committed to this. My name is already in front of Aldrin, and Aldrin's name is going to be in front of Langley before the week is out. I've already pulled the trigger. She held his gaze. I'm asking if there are people here who are tired enough and angry enough and brave enough to pull it with me. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying more snow. Elias was quiet for a very long time. Hester Crane, he said finally. We can ride there Sunday. They rode to Hester Crane's place on Sunday morning, and by the time they arrived, Clara understood why Elias had said the word respect the way he had. Hester Crane was somewhere between 55 and 60, with gray-streaked hair pulled back without vanity, and hands that made Clara's fence-working blisters look decorative. She came to the door of her house before they'd dismounted, a rifle in the crook of her arm, and studied them with the unhurried attention of a woman who had made it her practice not to be surprised by anything. Carter, she said. Heard you got married. Not yet, Elias said. This is Clara Whitmore. Hester looked at Clara with a directness that most people softened into something more socially comfortable. Clara looked back with the same directness. "You're the one came off the train with the broken suitcase," Hester said. "That's me," Clara said. "Heard Langley's men came sniffing around your place." "Twice," Clara said. "Third time will probably involve a badge." Hester looked her over once more, then stepped back from the door. "Coffee's on," she said. "Come inside." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Clara talked. Hester listened with the intensity of someone who knew how to separate fact from emphasis, who had spent years listening to men overstate and understate and circle around the truth, and who could cut to the center of a thing with one question. "You've got documents that show fraud," Hester said, about 40 minutes in. "Documents that could demonstrate fraud, in the right court, with the right argument," Clara said. "My attorney believes they have standing. He needs time to build the case." "How much time?" "He says a year. I think we can push it to 8 months if the other evidence is strong." "What other evidence?" Clara looked at her directly. "Testimony. People who can speak to how Langley operates. The pattern of the fence complaints, the debt manipulation, the manufactured legal pressure. The individual stories might not be enough, but together." "He holds my note," Hester said. "Did Carter tell you that?" "He told me. If I testify against him and the case fails, he calls it the next day." "I know. I'd lose this place." "I know." Hester was quiet. She looked at the table, at her coffee cup, at her hands. "My husband built this place," she said. "Took him 20 years. He died the spring before last, and I've been running it alone since, and Langley's been circling ever since word got out that I was by myself out here." She paused. "He made me an offer 3 weeks after the funeral. 3 weeks. Like he'd been waiting for Walt to die so he could make his move." She looked up. "I told him what he could do with his offer." "I remember," Elias said quietly. "The nerve of that man," Hester said, with a flatness that contained a depth of anger Clara recognized as kin to her own. "The absolute nerve." The room was quiet. "If this works," Clara said carefully, "and I believe it can work, Langley doesn't just lose this case, his entire financial structure gets examined. Every note he holds, every debt he's manufactured, every questionable transaction. The fraud documents implicate his banking operations. That's what Aldrin told me. It's not just a land dispute, it's a financial crime case. And if it goes that way, the notes he holds—" She stopped. "Let Hester follow it to the end." Hester followed it. "If the notes are part of a fraudulent operation," Hester said slowly, "they might not be legally enforceable." "That's Aldrin's read," Clara said. "He was careful about how he phrased it, but yes." The silence stretched. "Who else are you talking to?" Hester said. "You're first," Clara said. "I wanted to understand what we're asking before I asked anyone else." Hester looked at Elias. "You believe her?" "I believe her," he said, simply. Hester picked up her coffee cup, set it back down. "Tom Bledsoe," she said. "He's got a farm 6 miles south. Langley's been squeezing him for 2 years. His boy got sick last winter, and he had to go into debt for the doctor, and Langley bought the note before he could blink. He's got no love for the man." She paused. "And there's Ruth Hendricks, at the general store. Her husband thinks he's managing their situation, but I know for a fact that Ruth knows exactly what Langley's been doing to their margins." Clara thought of Ruth Hendricks, who had posted her letters without asking questions and kept accounts that showed a woman who understood precisely what was happening to her family's finances. "I know Ruth," Clara said. "Then you know she's smart," Hester said. "Smarter than most people give her credit for." "Yes," Clara said. "I know." Hester stood up. "I'm not saying yes yet," she said, "but I'm not saying no." She looked at Clara with that same unsparing directness. "You're not what I expected either." "Nobody ever is," Clara said. Hester almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. They rode home in the early afternoon, the snow crusted and hard under the horses' hooves, the air carrying that smell Clara had learned to translate as more coming. "She'll do it," Elias said. "Maybe," Clara said. "She will. I've known Hester Crane for 11 years. When she says she's not saying no, That's the closest she gets to yes until she's ready to commit. He glanced at her. You handled her right. I told her the truth, Clara said. That's all. That's not nothing, he said. Lot of people come at Hester with angles. She can smell an angle from 2 rooms away. Clara thought about that. About angles and truth and the distance between them. My father always said the truth was the strongest argument, she said. He also said most people are afraid to use it because it doesn't leave anywhere to hide. She paused. He was right on both counts. Elias rode beside her and said nothing for a moment. He sounds like he was a good man, he said. How was? She said. He was a very good man, and it got him destroyed. She kept her eyes on the road. I'm trying to figure out how to be a good person and also someone who doesn't get destroyed. I'm not entirely sure those can coexist. They can, Elias said. I've seen it. Where? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. My mother, he said finally. She was honest all the way through. Honest and tough, and it wasn't easy, but she didn't break. He paused. She would have liked you. Clara felt that land somewhere unexpected and tender. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Thank you, she said, when she could say it without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. They rode the rest of the way in the new kind of quiet. The comfortable one. The one that had slowly, without announcement, replaced the other kind. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon light, and on the porch, tied to the post, was a horse she didn't recognize. Elias went very still in the saddle. That's not Pete's horse, he said. No, Clara agreed. I don't know whose it is. They rode in slowly. The man on the porch stood up when they came into the yard. Middle-aged, neatly dressed, not frontier dressed, not local, but the kind of careful suit that said, I came from somewhere with tailors. He had a leather satchel and the unhurried bearing of someone who had traveled a long way and planned to say exactly what he came to say. Mr. Carter, he said. Miss Whitmore? Who's asking? Elias said. The man reached into his satchel and produced a card. My name is Samuel Reeves, he said. I'm a federal land inspector, out of the territorial office in Helena. He paused. I've received a formal complaint regarding the Carter land claim. I'm here to conduct a preliminary inquiry. He looked at both of them steadily. I'd like to begin first thing tomorrow morning. Clara looked at Elias. Elias looked at her. And Victor Langley, without knowing it, had just moved his timeline forward by 3 months. The next move was theirs. Samuel Reeves did not look like a man who could be bought. That was the first thing Clara clocked about him, standing in the yard with the cold coming down and his leather satchel under his arm, and his eyes moving between her and Elias with the patient, measuring quality of someone who had seen a great many situations and learned not to rush his conclusions. The second thing she clocked was that he was nervous, not visibly, not in any way that Dobb or Briggs would have noticed. But she had grown up watching her father read rooms full of businessmen, and she had inherited his eye for the small things, the way Reeves's thumb moved against the edge of his satchel strap, small repeated press, the way he'd produced his card just a fraction too quickly, like a man who needed the credentialing to do some of the work for him. Samuel Reeves had not come here entirely of his own free will. Come inside, Elias said. Not warm, but not hostile. The voice he used when he was reserving judgment. It's too cold to stand in the yard. They sat around the table, the same table where Clara had laid out the ledger numbers, where she and Elias had worked through the documents, where they'd eaten in silence that first week, and in something closer to companionship every week since. Reeves set his satchel on the floor, folded his hands, and began. The complaint was filed 11 days ago, he said, by Victor Langley, acting through his attorney, on behalf of the Broken Spur Land and Banking Company. He spoke the words with careful neutrality, the kind that didn't endorse and didn't condemn. The claim is that the eastern boundary markers of this property were moved approximately 40 feet to the east sometime in the past 18 months, encroaching on land held by Mr. Langley's company. That's false, Elias said. I haven't made any determination yet, Reeves said. I know you haven't, Elias said. I'm telling you it's false, so we're clear on where I stand. Reeves looked at Clara. She'd been quiet, watching. Miss Whitmore, he said, you mentioned to Deputy Marshal Briggs that you had access to the original survey documentation for this property. I do, she said. I can have it ready for you first thing in the morning, if you'd like to begin then. I would. He paused. I'll also need to walk the eastern boundary line myself, with both of you, if possible, and with witnesses from the neighboring property if available. Neighboring property is Langley's, Elias said. His men have been riding that line twice a week for months. I'm aware, Reeves said, and something in the way he said it, flat, deliberate, too careful, made Clara pay very close attention. Mr. Reeves, she said, how long have you been a federal land inspector? 11 years, he said. And in 11 years, how many boundary complaints have you investigated that turned out to be legitimate? He looked at her. The thumb on the satchel strap stopped moving. Enough to take each one seriously, he said. And how many were filed by a single party against multiple neighbors within the same county, within the same year? A pause. Longer than it should have been. That's not a question I'm in a position to answer right now, he said, because you don't know, or because the answer would be uncomfortable. Clara, Elias said quietly. She didn't push it. She'd gotten what she needed, which wasn't an answer but a confirmation. The way a man's silence can be louder than anything he says. Reeves stayed the night in the barn. Elias offered the loft. Reeves declined with the particular tact of a man who understood that declining was the correct social move. Clara made coffee. They ate without much conversation. And after Reeves had gone out to settle himself in the barn, Elias and Clara sat across the table and talked in low voices for an hour. He's not Langley's man, Clara said. No, Elias agreed. But Langley filed the complaint, and Langley's got the territorial office in his pocket at least part way. Reeves didn't choose to come here. He was sent, but he's not happy about it. Which means? Which means if the documentation is solid, and the boundary markers are exactly where they're supposed to be, he'll file an accurate report. She paused. The question is what Langley does when the report comes back clean. He escalates, Elias said, without hesitation, like a man who had been waiting for that moment and had already decided how to face it. Yes, Clara said. He escalates. They looked at each other across the table. The documents are safe, she said. Pete should be in Helena by now. Then Aldrin has them. She pressed her hands flat on the table. We need Reeves's report to be clean. We need it documented, witnessed, and filed before Langley can interfere with it. And then... She stopped. And then we go on offense, Elias said. It was the first time either of them had used that word. Offense. They'd been defending, preparing, strengthening, building the walls higher. Going on offense was different. Going on offense meant they stopped waiting for Langley to make the next move and started making moves of their own. Yes, Clara said. Then we go on offense. He nodded slowly. Outside, the snow came down in earnest for the first time, heavy and real, the winter making its first serious statement. Clara looked at the window, at the white accumulating against the glass. She thought about her father, who had waited too long and been too careful and lost everything. She was not going to be too careful. The boundary inspection took most of the following day. They walked every foot of the eastern line. Elias, Clara, Reeves, and 2 men. Elias had brought from town, neither of them Langley's, both of them long-time residents who knew this land the way you know the face of someone you've lived next to for years. Old Marcus Webb, who'd been ranching in the valley since before half the current residents were born, and a younger man named Cole Dawson, who ran the livery, and whose honest, uncomplicated dislike of Langley was a matter of public record. Reeves measured. He documented. He compared each marker against the original survey records Clara had laid out for him that morning. Clean, organized, annotated in her own handwriting in the margins, where she'd cross-referenced measurements against the ledger records and the neighboring property deeds she'd located at the county land office during a trip to town 2 weeks prior that she had told Elias was for supplies. He hadn't asked why she'd gone into the land office, She hadn't explained. She was learning that the best way to work alongside Elias Carter was to do the thing and explain it afterward, because asking permission put him in the position of either granting it or withholding it, and he was a man who, given the choice, defaulted to caution. Better to act and report. He'd shown no signs of objecting to anything she'd done yet, and she'd filed that as useful information about his character. Every marker was exactly where it was supposed to be. Not approximately. Not within a reasonable margin. Exactly. Reeves straightened from the last one, brushed the snow off his coat, and looked at the line of posts running north to south with the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he'd already suspected. "Boundaries clean," Marcus Webb said. He said it to Reeves, but he was looking at Clara, and the look was one she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not from a man in this county. It was something close to respect, the kind that gets earned rather than offered. "It appears so," Reeves said carefully. "Appears," Elias said. "The documentation supports the claim as filed," Reeves said, with the deliberate word choice of a man who knew that everything he said out here was going to be repeated. "I'll need to complete my written assessment. I can have a preliminary report filed within 10 days. "We'd like a copy of that report," Clara said. Reeves looked at her. "That's your right to request." "Good," she said. "We're requesting it." Something almost like a smile crossed his face. Very brief. Gone before she could be certain she'd seen it. On the ride back to the ranch, Cole Dawson pulled his horse alongside hers. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "you know Langley's going to hear about this before Reeves even gets back to his horse." "I know," she said. "He's got someone watching," Cole said. "Almost certainly. He'll know the inspection went clean before Reeves files the report." "Then we don't have 10 days," she said. "We probably have 3. Cole was quiet for a moment. "What happens in 3 days?" "One of 2 things," Clara said. "Either Langley backs off and waits for a better moment, or he decides he's been patient long enough and does something direct." She paused. "I'm planning for the second option." Cole looked at her sideways. He was younger than she'd first thought. Mid-20s probably, with an old quality to his eyes that came from having seen too much too early. "What does planning for the second option look like?" "It looks like not being caught off guard when it comes," she said. He nodded slowly. "My grandfather lost his land to a man like Langley," he said. "Back in Kentucky, before the family moved west. Took everything he built. I was 6 years old and I still remember my grandmother crying." He looked straight ahead. "I'll help if you need it. Whatever you need." She looked at him. "Can you get word to Tom Bledsoe?" she said. "Hester Crane said he might be willing to talk." "Bledsoe and I go back," Cole said. "Yeah, I can get word to him. Tell him I'd like to meet, this week if possible." "I'll ride out tonight," Cole said. He peeled off at the fork in the road, heading south, and Clara watched him go with the specific feeling of something gathering, small forces aligning, the way water finds its own level, the way people who have been waiting for a reason to move begin moving when one appears. She turned her horse back toward the ranch. Elias was riding just ahead of her, and he slowed to let her come alongside. "Cole Dawson's going to talk to Bledsoe," she said. He took that in without surprise. "You've been busy." "I've been preparing," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her with that recalibrating expression, the one she'd first seen on the train platform and had been watching refine itself over weeks into something more specific. Something she didn't examine too closely, because examining it led to thoughts she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "What do you need me to do?" he said. Same words as before, different weight to them now. "I need you to be ready," she said. "When Langley moves, it's going to happen fast. He doesn't telegraph when he's committed. He just acts." "I know his methods," Elias said quietly. "I know you do." She paused. "How did he come after you the first time?" He was quiet for a moment. "Cattle," he said. 3 years ago. He claimed a dozen of my animals had strayed onto his property and damaged his fence. Wanted compensation. I knew the cattle hadn't strayed. I'd counted them myself the day before. But he had 2 men ready to swear they'd seen it, and the local magistrate at the time was... He paused. "Cooperative. I paid. I didn't have the resources to fight it then. But you remembered, Clara said. I remember everything he's done, Elias said. And his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger exactly. Older than anger. The sustained, banked kind of fury that doesn't burn hot because it's been burning too long. She understood that completely. Then let's make sure he doesn't get to do it again, she said. Tom Bledsoe came to the ranch on Thursday. Howe was a compact, careful man in his early 40s, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to make himself small in rooms where danger was present. The habitual self-effacement of a person who had been squeezed too long. But his eyes were sharp, and his handshake was firm, and when Clara laid out the situation in plain terms, sitting across from him at the table that had become her command center over the past weeks, he listened with the full-body attention of a man who had been waiting for someone to say exactly this. He bought my note 6 months after my boy got sick, Bledsoe said. I didn't even know he'd purchased it until the bank sent a letter saying the note had been transferred and my new payment terms were... He stopped. Different. The original rate was 7%. The transferred note had a clause I hadn't seen that bumped it to 11 under certain conditions. Conditions that, coincidentally, I'd already met. Can you document the original terms? Clara asked. I've got the original paperwork, he said. My wife kept everything. Every document, every letter, every payment receipt. She said one day we'd need it. His jaw moved. She was right. Ruth Hendricks, Clara said. Have you spoken to her? Bledsoe looked slightly surprised. Ruth? Sure, I know Ruth. Good woman. She's been helping me, Clara said. Quietly. She's not ready to come forward publicly yet, but she knows what's happening and she's not afraid of it. If we get to the point where testimony is needed, she may be the most credible voice in the county. She's seen the financial side from the inside of a business Langley's been squeezing. Ruth could do it, Bledsoe agreed slowly. Her husband now. Henry's scared. He won't want her involved. I know, Clara said. That's Ruth's decision to make, and I'm not going to push her before she's ready. She paused. But I want you to know she's aware of what we're building. You're not alone in this. Something in Bledsoe's face shifted. It was a small thing. A slight loosening around the eyes. A breath that went a little deeper than the ones before it. The specific physical response of a person who has been carrying something alone and is told, for the first time, that they're not. What do you need from me? He said. Right now, just a willingness to be contacted by George Aldrin's office when the time comes. Your documentation, reviewed by his team. And your word that if it reaches the point of formal proceedings, you'll stand up and say what you know. Bledsoe looked at Elias. You trust her, he said. I do, Elias said. Bledsoe looked back at Clara. Then yeah, he said. You've got my word. After he left, Clara sat for a moment in the quiet of the cabin and let herself feel the accumulation of it. Hester Crane's almost yes. Cole Dawson's offer. Bledsoe's handshake. The documents safe in Helena. Reeves's clean inspection still 10 days from filing. Pieces, all of them. Pieces of something larger she could see the shape of even if she couldn't yet see the whole. You're building something, Elias said from across the room. He'd been watching her with the same attention he gave the cattle. The kind that noticed changes before they were obvious, that read small signals for larger meaning. I've been building it since the 4th day, she said. I know, he said. I've been watching. He paused. Clara, when Langley finds out Bledsoe was here, and he will find out, someone in town will see his horse outside. Someone always sees. What does he do? He accelerates, she said. To what? She looked at him across the cabin, in the firelight, with the snow falling outside, and the warmth they'd built between them. In the routine, in the work, in the shared meals, and the shared silence, and the thing that had no name yet, and that she was not yet prepared to give one, steady and real around her. I don't know exactly, she said, which was honest. But I know it will be something he thinks we can't handle. And can we? She held his eyes. Yes, she said. But we're going to have to hold each other up to do it. It was the most direct thing she'd said to him. About them. About what they were, what they'd become. The partnership that had started as necessity and had become something else. She didn't look away from it, and she didn't dress it up, and she didn't qualify it. He didn't look away either. "All right," he said. The same two words as before, the same flatness, the same certainty that, she'd learned, was how Elias Carter made his deepest commitments. 4 days later, the storm hit. Not a metaphor. An actual storm. The kind the old-timers in Broken Spur described with the reverence people reserve for things they survived rather than understood. It came in the night, and by morning, the world had been remade in white, deep and serious. The temperature dropped to a place where exposed skin told you about it immediately. Clara had been raised in St. Louis, and she knew cold. She did not know this cold. She learned it fast. The cattle were the first priority, and Elias was out before she'd finished dressing, and she pulled on everything she had. The work jacket, the gloves she'd acquired in town, the boots that had replaced her ruined city shoes 2 weeks prior, and went out behind him without being asked. The next 6 hours were the hardest physical labor of her life. She didn't say that. She didn't say anything that wasn't functional. Call and response between her and Elias, brief and efficient, the kind of communication that strips language down to only what the situation requires. South fence holding. North gate drifted over, need the shovel. Counts off by 3, check the east corner. Back and forth, moving through the snow and the cold and the screaming wind, doing the work because the work was what was needed. The 3 missing cattle were in the east corner, pressed against the fence, alive but cold. She helped move them herself, bodily, pushing against 700 pounds of reluctant animal with everything she had, her shoulders burning, her fingers numb inside the gloves. They got them in. Inside the barn, with the animals settled and the wind making its argument against the walls, Clara leaned against a post and breathed. Elias came and stood near her. Not touching, just near. "You're going to feel that tomorrow," he said, looking at her shoulders. "I feel it now," she said. He almost smiled. She'd gotten better at catching it. The particular subtle shift at the corner of his mouth that, on anyone else, would have been an obvious expression, and on him was the equivalent of a full grin. "You did good," he said. "We did good," she said. They stood there for a moment, side by side, in the warm, close air of the barn, with the storm raging outside, the animals breathing around them. The work done. It was, Clara thought, the closest to peace she'd felt since before her father got sick, which was exactly when Elias said, "One of the horses is missing." Her peace evaporated. "Which one?" "The gray mare." His voice had changed. "She was in the last stall this morning. She's not there now." They looked at each other. "The south gate," Clara said. "When you said it was drifted over." "I cleared it," he said. "But if she got out before I did..." He was already moving. "I have to go after her." "Elias." She caught his arm. "The temperature is dropping. If you go out in this..." "She's a good animal," he said. "She's been with me 6 years." "I know." She didn't release his arm. "I know. But if you go alone..." "I'm not taking you into this storm." "You're not taking me anywhere," she said. "I'm coming with you." He looked at her hand on his arm. At her face, which she suspected showed exactly what she felt, which was fear and determination in approximately equal measure. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me I can't handle it. We both know that's not true anymore." A long moment. He reached past her and took a second rope from the wall. "Stay close," he said. "Don't get more than 10 feet from me. If you can't see me, call out immediately." "Understood," she said. They went back into the storm. She understood within 30 seconds why people died in weather like this. Not from cold alone, though the cold was serious, but from the way the wind and snow together destroyed your sense of direction, your sense of up and down, your sense of how far you'd come and how far you needed to go. She kept her eyes on Elias's back, and she stayed within 10 feet, and she kept moving because stopping was the thing she understood instinctively that you could not do. He found the gray mare's tracks, or what remained of them, near the south tree line, and they followed them into the trees where the wind dropped enough to think, and there was the mare, pressed against a fallen log, one leg at an angle that made Clara's stomach drop before she'd even processed what she was seeing. Not broken. When Elias got his hands on her, moved around her carefully, he shook his head. Strained, he said. Not broken. She can walk. The relief was physical. Getting her back through the storm was 40 minutes of the most focused effort Clara had ever exerted. Elias led, the mare followed with painful reluctance, and Clara brought up the rear, pushing when the animal stalled, redirecting when she drifted, talking to her in a low, steady voice that she'd learned from Elias worked better than any amount of physical force. They got her back. In the barn, with the mare settled and her leg wrapped, Elias straightened up and turned and looked at Clara with an expression that was completely unguarded, something she'd never seen from him before, a kind of raw honesty that his face usually kept private. "Thank you," he said. She was shaking. She realized it only now, the cold and the effort and the adrenaline working their way out of her body. She folded her arms and kept herself steady through will. "You would have gone alone," she said. "Yes. And if something had happened to you out there, it didn't. It could have." He was quiet. "Elias." She needed him to understand something. "I need you to stop thinking of yourself as something I'm working alongside and start thinking of yourself as something I'm actually—" She stopped. Tried again. "We're not two people sharing a problem. We're one operation. If you go down, I go down. So you don't go into storms alone, not anymore." He looked at her for a long time. "That's not the arrangement we started with," he said quietly. "No," she said. "It's not." The barn was warm. The mare breathed behind them. The storm went on. "Clara," he said. His voice was different. Lower, something more careful in it. The way you carry a thing you've been holding for a long time and have finally decided to put down and look at directly. She looked at him. "When this is over," he said, "when Langley's dealt with and the documents are in front of whatever court needs to see them and the ranch is on solid ground," he paused, "I'd like this to be real." She knew what he meant. Not the arrangement, not the agreement, not the practical alliance. Something else. Something they'd been building in the margins of everything else, in the shared work and the shared meals and the shared silences, and the way he'd said my mother would have liked you, and the way she'd felt safe for the first time in a long time. "It already is real," she said quietly. He nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting something large. "Then let's finish it," he said. "Together." And they walked back out into the storm, side by side, neither of them in front. That was the night everything changed. Not in any dramatic way. Not with declarations or gestures or any of the things stories use to mark important moments. Just the accumulation of everything they'd built, pressed up against the reality of everything that was coming, and two people deciding, quietly, completely, without hedging, that they were going to face it as one. Victor Langley, however, had been watching the storm too, and Dobb had come to his office that morning with news that changed his calculations entirely. "Bledsoe met with her at the ranch," Dobb said. "Hester Crane is talking to her too, and Cole Dawson's been riding around having conversations he shouldn't." Langley was very still. "She's building a coalition," Dobb said. "Yes," Langley said. "What do we do?" Langley looked out the window at the white obliteration of the storm. He'd been too patient. He'd believed the approach he'd used on her father. Incremental pressure, manufactured legality, death by 1,000 cuts, would work on her too. It had worked on everyone else. He'd been wrong. She wasn't like everyone else. "The storm is going to keep them pinned for 2-3 days," he said. "When it breaks—" He paused. "I want the ranch documents." Dobb looked at him. "You mean—" "I want someone in that cabin," Langley said. "Search it completely. Whatever she's been hiding, I want it found before she can put it in front of a judge." "She might have already moved it." "Then we'll know that too," Langley said, "and we'll adjust." He turned from the window. "And Dobb." His voice went flat and cold. "No more courtesy calls. No more courtesy anything. We're done being polite." The storm howled against the glass, And Clara Whitmore, who had survived it once already tonight, was about to have to survive it again. The storm broke on the third day. Clara knew it before she looked out the window. The quality of the silence changed, the specific exhausted quiet that follows something violent. The world holding its breath after the worst had passed. She was already dressed when Elias came down from where he'd been sleeping on the floor near the hearth, because neither of them had made it to their proper beds in the last 2 nights, both of them taking turns checking the animals through the worst hours. She handed him coffee before he'd asked for it. He took it without comment, which was its own kind of language now. "Reeves will file his report today or tomorrow," she said. "The roads will be passable by afternoon." "And Langley will know about Bledsoe's visit," Elias said. "Not a question. He probably already does." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Elias, I need to go into town." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "I need to see Ruth Hendricks," she said. "And I need to send a wire to Aldrin's office, face to face with Ruth. Not a letter, not a message through Cole. Direct." She paused. "And I need to do it before Langley has time to build his next move." "I'll take you in," he said. "You need to stay with the animals, the mare's leg." "Cole can check the mare," he said. "I'm not sending you into town alone, not now." She looked at him, thought about arguing, decided against it. Not because she couldn't manage alone, but because the look on his face told her this wasn't pride or overprotection. It was the same practical calculation he applied to everything. 2 people in a room are harder to corner than 1. "Fine," she said. "We go together." They rode into Broken Spur 2 hours after the roads cleared enough to manage, and Clara felt the town's attention before they'd gone half a block down the main street. It was the specific quality of attention that meant word had traveled. Everyone already positioned, already knowing something. The way a room feels when you walk into a conversation about yourself. Ruth Hendricks was alone in the store when they came in, her husband Henry visible through the back window moving crates in the storage yard. She looked at Clara with the quick, intelligent eyes that Clara had come to depend on, and she said to Elias, very pleasantly, "Mr. Carter, I have that harness oil you ordered. It's in the back, might take a few minutes to find." Elias understood immediately. He went to the back. Ruth came around the counter fast, her voice dropping. "Dob was in here yesterday morning," she said. "Before the storm got bad. He was asking about you, about your habits, who you'd been talking to, whether you'd sent anything unusual through the mail." Clara's chest tightened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you bought flour and salt and a new pair of work gloves, and that you were the most boring customer I had," Ruth said. "Which is a complete lie, and we both know it." She paused. "Clara, he knows about the letters to Helena. He knows I wrote to someone in Helena, or he knows who." "He knows Aldrin's name," Ruth said. "Someone at the postal station in Billings. The letters passed through Billings going east. Someone there talked." Clara thought very fast. If Langley knew Aldrin's name, he knew the case was further along than a simple land dispute. Aldrin was known in the territory. Not notorious, but known. The kind of lawyer you hired when you were building something serious. The moment Langley connected Aldrin's name to Clara's situation, he would understand exactly how far she'd gotten, which meant the timeline had just collapsed. "How long ago did Dob have this information?" Clara said. "He's known Aldrin's name since at least the day before yesterday," Ruth said. "Maybe longer." Which meant Langley had known for 2 days. 2 days while the storm kept the roads closed and Clara and Elias were pinned to the ranch. "Ruth," Clara said, "I need you to think carefully about something. You don't have to answer today. You don't have to answer at all. But I need to ask." She held the woman's eyes. "When the time comes, and it's going to come soon, I believe within weeks, would you be willing to speak to what you've seen? About Langley's methods? About what he's done to your family's margins? About the debt manipulation you've watched him work through the banking relationships?" Ruth was very still. "Henry won't allow it," she said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm asking what you would do." The silence between them lasted long enough to be a real answer in itself. "I've been keeping records," Ruth said quietly. "For 3 years. Every questionable charge, every adjusted term, Every time something about our account changed without explanation. I've got it all in a book." She paused. Henry doesn't know about the book. Clara felt something move through her that she couldn't name exactly. Not quite hope, but the texture of it. "Can I tell Aldrin about you?" Clara said. "Not your name yet. Just that there's a potential witness with 3 years of documented financial records." Ruth's jaw worked. She looked at the back window where her husband was still moving crates. "Tell him there might be," she said finally. "Tell him to be ready for the might." It was enough. It was more than enough. Elias came back from the rear of the store at exactly the right moment, carrying a tin of harness oil with the expression of a man who had found what he was looking for in about 45 seconds, and spent the rest of the time usefully examining the wall. They were back at the counter, Clara and Ruth, looking like two women concluding a casual exchange about domestic supplies. Ruth gave Clara a small nod. Clara nodded back. "Send us a pound of coffee when the supply wagon comes through," Clara said. "I'll put it on the order," Ruth said. They left the store. On the sidewalk, Elias said quietly, "Good news or complicated news?" "Complicated," Clara said. "Langley knows about Aldrin." She watched him process it. The slight tension in his jaw, the way he looked at the street without seeing it, running through implications. "How long has he known?" 2 days at least. Then we're already behind. Yes. I didn't say anything dramatic about that. He just said, "Wire to Aldrin first," and they walked to the telegraph office. The wire took 10 minutes to compose and send. Clara kept it precise. Langley aware of representation, timeline accelerated. Advise on immediate legal protections available for the land claim and any associated documents already in your possession. She signed it with her name, not a pseudonym, not a code. Hiding was done. There was no point in it now. The telegraph operator, a young man with ink-stained fingers, who had the careful neutrality of someone who understood that his job required him to pretend not to read what he transmitted, handed her the receipt without meeting her eyes. She took it and walked out. Elias was waiting on the sidewalk, and he tilted his head slightly toward the other side of the street, which was how she'd learned he indicated something worth noticing without wanting to make it obvious he was noticing it. She looked. Dobbs' horse was outside the saloon, and beside it, a horse she didn't recognize. A big roan, well-fed, with good tack. Not a local horse, someone who'd come in from somewhere else. "Do you know that horse?" she said quietly. "No," Elias said. "But the tack is expensive. Not frontier expensive. East Coast expensive." She looked at it for a moment longer. "Langley's bringing in outside help," she said. "Looks that way." "For what exactly?" "Don't know yet," he said. "But outside help means he's decided local pressure isn't working." They rode home faster than they'd ridden in. The letter from Aldrin arrived 4 days later, brought by a courier who had ridden hard from Helena and who accepted Clara's offer of food and a warm fire with the gratitude of a man who had earned both. She read it at the table while Elias sat across from her and waited. It was 3 pages. Dense, precise, with none of the hedging of the first letter. Whatever caution Aldrin had been exercising before, knowing the timeline had collapsed, had stripped it away. The news was this. The documents were solid. Better than solid. In the hands of a federal court, with the corroborating testimony Aldrin now understood she was building, they constituted a complete case for systematic financial fraud, with land acquisition as the mechanism. He had already been in contact with a colleague in the Territorial Federal Office, a man named Justice Carver, who had expressed significant interest. The critical news was this. Federal interest changed the stakes entirely. This was no longer a local dispute that Langley could manage through Briggs and a cooperative county court. Federal involvement meant federal jurisdiction, which meant Langley's network of local influence became largely irrelevant. The dangerous news was this. Aldrin had heard, through his colleague, that Langley had retained a man named Harlan Cross. Cross was an attorney from Denver, with a reputation for aggressive tactics in land and resource disputes. He had won cases that shouldn't have been winnable by attacking the credibility and personal history of opposing witnesses rather than engaging with the evidence directly. Aldrin's note in the margin, in that different ink again. Cross will come after you specifically, Clara. Your personal history, your father's business failure, your position as a mail-order bride. He will try to make you small in the eyes of any jury or judge. This is what he does. Be ready for it. She put the letter down. Elias had been watching her face as she read. Bad? He said. Mixed, she said. Federal interest. That's very good. And Langley's brought in a man named Harlan Cross. That's... She paused. That's what they do when the evidence is too strong to fight directly. They fight the person instead. What does that mean in practice? It means Cross is going to try to make me look unreliable, motivated by personal grievance rather than legitimate legal claim. A woman who came here under false pretenses to pursue a vendetta against a powerful man using a sympathetic rancher as cover. She said it flat and even, the way you say things when you need to hear them to prepare for them. He's going to dig into everything, my father's company, the debts, the reasons I signed with the marriage agency, every decision I've made since I arrived. Elias was very quiet. And the marriage, he said carefully. The fact that we haven't, that we're not. Yes, she said. That too. The thing they hadn't named. The practical reality that they had been living in the same cabin for weeks, that the arrangement had never been formalized, that in the eyes of anyone looking for something to use, they were two unmarried people in a complicated situation that could be made to look like exactly what Cross would need it to look like. We'd have to actually get married, Elias said, stated, not asked. Only if you're willing, Clara said, and kept her voice completely level, because this was the most important conversation they'd had, and she was not going to let her own feelings contaminate it. Not for any reason other than the legal one, if that's what you want. I understand the practical situation fully, and I wouldn't ask you to. Clara, he said. She stopped. I told you in the barn, he said. I want this to be real. He held her eyes. So it's real, if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm willing, she said. He nodded, stood up, picked up his hat from the peg by the door. I'll ride to town tomorrow and speak to the magistrate, he said. We can do it by the end of the week. He said it the way he said everything, flat, certain, without performance. As if it were just the next thing on the list. And somehow that was more moving than any elaborate declaration would have been. She turned back to Aldrin's letter, so he wouldn't see her face. There's more, she said. Aldrin needs Hester Crane's testimony formally documented before Cross arrives. And he needs Bledsoe's financial records, originals, not copies, in Helena within 2 weeks. Bledsoe's records we can manage, Elias said, sitting back down. Hester will need to go to Helena herself if it's formal documentation. Can she travel right now? She's got ranch hands. She can spare a week if she decides to. He paused. She'll decide to. She's been waiting for an excuse to do something about Langley for 2 years. I'll ride to her tomorrow, Clara said. You go to the magistrate. We move on everything at once. On everything at once, he confirmed. They worked until late that night. Writing lists, reviewing the sequence, mapping out who needed to do what, and in what order, and by when. It was the most complex coordination either of them had managed, and it required the kind of sustained shared focus that had become, over the weeks, almost effortless, each of them knowing how the other thought, filling in gaps, anticipating questions. Clara fell asleep at the table somewhere past midnight, her head on her arms, Aldrin's letter still spread out before her. She woke to a blanket across her shoulders that hadn't been there when she closed her eyes. Elias was at the hearth, tending the fire. He didn't look at her. She didn't say anything. She gathered the papers, folded them carefully, and went up to the loft. They were married on a Friday, 4 days after the storm broke, in the magistrate's office in Broken Spur, with Cole Dawson and Ruth Hendricks as witnesses, because Elias had asked Cole and Clara had asked Ruth, and both of them had said yes, without hesitation. It was not romantic, or rather, it was not elaborate. The room was small, and the ceremony was brief, and the magistrate, a good-natured man named Peter Walsh, who had no visible relationship with Langley's interests, kept it efficient out of an apparent awareness that the two people in front of him were in a hurry for reasons he didn't need to know. Clara wore her second dress. She had two now, the blue one she'd arrived in and a dark green one she'd found at the dry goods store for a reasonable price. She had not bought it for this occasion specifically, but it was the better of the two, and she was not without vanity about certain things. Elias wore his good shirt. They stood side by side and answered when they were supposed to answer, and signed where they were supposed to sign. When it was done, Ruth Hendricks, who had been holding herself with remarkable composure throughout, put her arms around Clara and held on briefly, tightly, the way you hold someone when you want them to know something that doesn't fit into words. Clara held on back. Cole Dawson shook Elias's hand and said, "About time," with a grin, and Elias said, "Mind your business, Cole," but without any heat behind it. They walked out into the cold together. Husband and wife. Partners in every sense they'd already been partners in, and now in the legal sense too, with paperwork to prove it. Dobb was across the street. He saw them. She saw him see them. He understood what had just happened. He was reading the magistrate's office, the witnesses, the timing. And she watched him process the implication. Whatever angle Cross had been planning to use about their personal arrangement, it had just closed. She looked at Dobb directly. She didn't smile. She didn't make any gesture. She just held his eyes for 3 seconds and then looked away. That was enough. Two things happened within the next 72 hours that neither of them had anticipated, and they happened in the wrong order, which was how Clara knew that Langley had moved faster than she'd predicted. The first thing, Hester Crane arrived at the ranch on Saturday morning, not because Clara had ridden out to ask her, she hadn't had the chance yet, but because Hester had heard about the wedding from someone in town and had drawn her own conclusions about what it meant and what was coming next. She rode into the yard with that rifle in the crook of her arm and said, without preamble, "Tell me what you need me to do." Clara felt something settle in her chest. "I need you in Helena," she said. "As soon as you can manage. Aldrin needs your testimony formally documented." "I can leave Monday," Hester said. "I've got 2 ranch hands who can manage without me for a week." She paused. "I'm bringing the record book." "What record book?" Hester reached into the saddlebag and produced a worn leather notebook. "Every time Langley's men have ridden my fence line. Every offer he's made me, with dates and amounts and who was present. Every time something on my property was interfered with and I couldn't prove it was him, but I knew." She set it on the porch railing. 3 years of it. Clara picked it up, opened it, looked at the careful, precise handwriting, dated entries, specific details, the work of a woman who had decided very early on that if the moment came, she was going to be prepared for it. It was, in its own way, exactly what her father had never had. Documentation. Contemporaneous, specific, consistent. "Hester," she said, "this is extraordinary." "It's just what I saw," Hester said, with the particular modesty of people who do important things and don't consider them important because they were just doing what needed doing. "Write down what happens. That's all." "Can I keep this until Monday? I want to include a summary for Aldrin in my next wire." "That's why I brought it," Hester said. She stayed for coffee. She and Elias talked about the gray mare's leg with the easy familiarity of two people who had been neighbors long enough to trust each other's judgment on animals. And Clara sat across from them and felt for a few minutes something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Normal. The particular texture of normal that includes people around a table and warmth, and the sense that the world outside, while difficult, has not yet gotten through the door. That was Saturday morning. The second thing happened Saturday night. Elias had gone out for the last evening check and came back in moving differently. The quick, contained quality he had when something was wrong, and he was controlling how he delivered it. "South fence," he said. Clara stood up immediately. "How bad?" "3 sections down. Wire cut, not broken. Posts pulled from the ground." He paused. "The cattle are scattered. I did a quick count. We're missing at least a dozen. Wire cut. Posts pulled. This was not weather damage or animal pressure. This was deliberate." "When?" she said. "Sometime in the last 4 hours. It was intact when I checked at noon. 4 hours. Which meant it had been done in the late afternoon, when the light was going and the temperature was dropping, and anyone working outside was likely to have come in early. "Langley's men," she said. It wasn't a question. "Had to be," Elias said. "Nobody else has reason." She thought very fast. This was Langley's move. Not a legal one this time. Not a manufactured complaint or a deputy with a badge. This was direct property damage, designed to accomplish two things simultaneously: scatter the cattle they needed for the spring sale, and create the appearance of a struggling, poorly managed operation, in case Reeves or any federal inspector came back for a follow-up. "We need witnesses to the damage," she said, "before anything gets repaired. We need someone to see the cut wire and the pulled posts and document it formally, tonight, before." "Cole," Elias said. "Can you reach him tonight?" "I'll ride for him now." "Go," she said. He went. She pulled on her coat and went out to the south fence herself, in the dark, with a lantern, and she looked at the cut wire and the pulled posts with the cold, cataloging attention she'd been training herself to apply to every problem since she arrived. She didn't touch anything. She just looked, and she committed it to memory, and she thought about what Harlan Cross would do with this, and how she was going to prevent him from doing it. He would say the fence had been poorly maintained. He would say the missing cattle were evidence of mismanagement. He would find some way to turn an act of deliberate sabotage into a narrative about incompetence, unless she got there first. Cole arrived an hour later, and with him, unexpectedly, Tom Bledsoe, who had apparently been at the livery when Elias came through and had refused to not come along. They documented everything. Cole had a notebook. Clara had learned that asking Cole to write things down was never necessary because he already was. And Bledsoe had, of all things, a small camera, the kind that was just becoming practical enough to be carried by ordinary people, that he'd ordered from a catalog the previous spring. "I got it to take pictures of the new calves," Bledsoe explained, with a slight air of apology for the eccentricity. "For records. Never thought I'd use it for this." Clara stared at the camera. "Tom," she said, "can you photograph the cut wire and the posts in enough detail that the cutting marks are visible?" "That's what the lamp's for," he said, and began setting up with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that his hobby had just become something more important than a hobby. They worked for 2 hours in the cold, documenting every section of the damage with the combined methods of Bledsoe's photographs and Cole's written descriptions and Clara's own careful measurements. She'd brought a measure from the cabin, the one she used for the ledger calculations, and she recorded the dimensions of every gap, every post hole, every stretch of cut wire. By the time they finished, she had something Langley hadn't intended to give her: physical evidence of the sabotage. Documented, witnessed, photographed, measured. When Harlan Cross tried to paint this as mismanagement, she was going to put Bledsoe's photographs in front of the court and let him explain the clean diagonal cut on wire that supposedly just gave way from neglect. Elias said nothing about the camera. He just looked at Bledsoe and then at Clara, and then he shook his head slightly, not in disapproval, but in the way you respond when the situation keeps being stranger and more fortuitous than you planned for. They spent Sunday repairing the fence and recovering the cattle. All 12 were found by mid-afternoon. Cold, annoyed, scattered across 2 miles of range, but alive and whole. The fence was rebuilt stronger than it had been before. Elias added a second wire at the bottom of the 3 worst sections, a modification Clara had suggested 2 weeks ago that he'd meant to get to and hadn't. Now he had. "Bledsoe's photographs," Clara said, when they were back inside that evening. "I need copies made and sent to Aldrin along with Cole's documentation, before Langley tries anything else." "I can take them to Helena myself," Elias said, "when Hester goes Monday." She looked at him. "That means you'd be away from the ranch for a week," she said. "Cole can manage for a week." "And if Langley moves again while you're gone?" He looked at her steadily. "Then you handle it," he said. "The same way you've been handling everything." He held her eyes. "Clara, you don't need me here to manage. You've demonstrated that repeatedly." She held his gaze. "I need you here because I want you here," she said. "There's a difference." Something moved through his expression. That unguarded quality she'd seen in the barn during the storm. The rarest version of him. "I know," he said quietly. "But right now, getting those photographs to Aldrin is worth more than what I can do on the fence line." He paused. "I'll ride Monday morning with Hester. I'll be back by the following Saturday." She thought about arguing. She thought about what her father would have done. Would have insisted on managing everything himself, on keeping everyone he loved close, on not distributing the risk. And then she thought about what that caution had cost him. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he said. Monday arrived with the specific crispness of a day that intends to be consequential. Hester left with her record book and her uncompromising posture. Elias left with Bledsoe's photographs, Cole's documentation, and a copy of Clara's letter to Aldrin that she'd written by lamplight at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. Clara stood in the yard and watched them go. Then she went inside and sat at the table and was alone with the ranch for the first time since she'd arrived. She thought about that. She looked around the cabin, the cleared flue, the mended hearth, the ledger books she'd reconstructed, the survey documentation she'd organized, the copy of Aldrin's letter tucked under a loose board in the floor where she'd also kept the copies of her father's documents. The window had glass now, installed 3 weeks ago, when she'd finally convinced Elias that the oilskin was losing the argument with the cold. She had done all of these things. She had come here with a broken suitcase and a worn blue dress and enough rage to fuel a locomotive, and she had done all of these things. The rooster, Victor, attempted to intimidate her at the door when she went to feed the chickens, and she moved him aside with her boot, with the practiced ease of weeks of practice, and did not feel even slightly victimized by it. She was on the way back from the barn when Cole rode in. He dismounted fast, which told her before he spoke. "Letter came," he said. "Ryder brought it from town. It's marked official, territorial courts." She took it. Harlan Cross had filed an injunction. She read it standing in the yard, in the cold, without moving. The injunction sought to freeze all financial and property transactions associated with the Carter Ranch claim, pending a review of the legitimacy of the original filing. It cited irregularities in the documentation. Irregularities that were, as far as Clara could tell from her careful review of every document in that land office box, entirely invented. But invented or not, an injunction meant legal proceedings, which meant time, which meant Langley's debt note could potentially be leveraged during the freeze to accelerate foreclosure. It was elegant. Terrible, but elegant. Cross had found the one angle that didn't require Langley's evidence to be better than hers. He didn't need better evidence. He just needed to slow everything down long enough for the financial timeline to do his work for him. Cole was watching her face. "How bad?" he said. She looked up from the letter. "Bad," she said, "but fixable." She folded the letter. "Cole, can you get me to the telegraph office in the next 2 hours? I can get you there in 1, he said. "Then let's go," she said. She wrote the wire to Aldrin in her head on the ride into town, the words arranging themselves with the speed that came from clarity, from knowing exactly what mattered and what didn't, from weeks of preparation that had been building toward exactly this kind of moment. Injunction filed by Cross, citing fabricated irregularities. Documents in your possession demonstrate the irregularities are false. Need emergency motion to contest on basis of federal interest already established. Photographs of deliberate property damage now in transit to you with Elias Carter, arriving Saturday. This is the escalation. We are ready. She sent it. Then she stood outside the telegraph office in the cold air of Broken Spur, on the main street her husband's enemy had built with money stolen from people like her father. And she thought about what her father had said on his last clear day. "Keep these. Don't bring them out until you're somewhere safe, and the moment is exactly right." She looked at the street. At Langley's bank, solid and imposing at the corner. At the saloon where the expensive roan horse had been tied the week before. At the general store where Ruth Hendricks was right now, keeping her record book in a place her husband didn't know about, waiting for the might to become a will. This was not the moment exactly right, but it was close. It was very, very close. And Clara Whitmore Carter, the name still new enough to feel like a coat she was still breaking in, straightened her spine on the sidewalk and looked at Victor Langley's bank with the specific expression that had replaced the grief and the fear and the quiet desperation she'd carried onto that train in St. Louis. The expression her father had never quite managed to find in time. The one that said, "I see exactly what you are, and I am not afraid of it, and you have already run out of moves you didn't know I was prepared for." She turned and walked back to where Cole was waiting with the horses. "Let's go home," she said. And Cole Dawson, who had known from the first time he'd seen her stand her ground in front of Dobbs' smiling condescension that this woman was going to change something in this valley, just nodded and handed her the reins. Aldrin's response came back in 18 hours. Clara had not slept. She'd told herself she would, had lain in the loft with her eyes closed, and the ranch quiet around her and Elias a week away in Helena. And she'd spent the hours instead running the sequence in her mind. Cross's injunction. The photographs in transit. Hester's record book. Ruth's hidden ledger. Bledsoe's original loan documents. The federal interest Aldrin had been cultivating in the territorial office. Each piece, each person, each decision she'd made or hadn't made. The things that could go wrong and the things that already had. She was at the table with coffee when Cole brought the wire just after dawn. She read it standing up. Aldrin had filed the emergency contest motion. Justice Carver, his contact in the federal territorial office, had responded with speed that told Clara he'd been ready and waiting for exactly this moment. The injunction was being challenged on federal jurisdictional grounds. The argument being that a land claim with established federal interest could not be frozen by a territorial court action without federal review first. Cross would know to expect this. But knowing to expect it and being able to stop it were different things. The critical line was near the bottom of the wire, and she read it twice. Carver has agreed to a formal hearing. 3 weeks. Helena, you and Carter will need to be present. Bring everyone. 3 weeks. She put the wire down on the table and sat with it. 3 weeks was not much time. 3 weeks was also more than she'd had at any previous point in this fight. And she had learned to measure not by what she wanted, but by what she had. She pulled out paper and began writing. The list of what needed to happen in 3 weeks was considerable. Hester's formal testimony, already in process. Bledsoe's financial records and the photographs, in Aldrin's hands by Saturday when Elias arrived. Ruth Hendricks. The question of Ruth was the one Clara kept returning to, the one variable she couldn't predict or control. The one person whose choice mattered enormously and was entirely her own to make. Cole came by mid-morning, and she told him about the hearing. "Helena," he said, 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara, you know Langley's going to hear about the hearing before the week's out. He's got someone in that federal office, same as he does everywhere." "I know. Which means he's going to do something between now and then. One more move. Something to try to destabilize the testimony or the documentation before it gets in front of Carver." "I know that too," she said. "That's why I need you to do something for me." "Name it." "I need you to talk to Henry Hendricks," she said. Cole looked at her with some surprise. "Henry's scared," Cole said. "You know that." "I know, but Cole." She paused, choosing the words carefully. Ruth has 3 years of documented records that could be the single most powerful piece of corroborating evidence in this case. Not just for our claim. For every claim Langley has manipulated through his banking operations. Justice Carver is looking at a fraud case. Ruth's records are exactly what a fraud case needs. She met Cole's eyes. "Henry is afraid of losing the store. What I need someone to help him understand is that if Langley's financial operations are found fraudulent, the notes he holds on businesses like Henry's may not be legally enforceable. Henry isn't just protecting himself by staying quiet. He's protecting the man who's been robbing him." Cole thought about that. "You want me to explain that to Henry Hendricks," he said slowly. "I want you to have a conversation with Henry, man to man, that gives him the information he needs to make a real decision. Not a fearful one, a real one." She paused. "That's all. What he does with it is his choice." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Henry's stubborn," he said. "I know. This might not work. I know that too. He picked up his hat. "I'll talk to him today," he said. She nodded. "Thank you, Cole." He was at the door when he turned back. "For what it's worth," he said. "My grandfather, the one who lost his land in Kentucky. He used to say the thing he regretted most wasn't that he fought and lost. It was that he didn't find the right people to fight with before it was too late." He looked at her steadily. "You found them." She held his eyes. "We all found each other," she said. He left. She turned back to her list and kept writing. Elias came home on Saturday, exactly when he said he would. She heard the horse in the yard and was at the door before he'd dismounted, and he looked at her as he came up the porch steps with the quick, assessing quality she'd come to recognize as his version of, "Are you all right?" Taking inventory, reading her face, noting what had changed in the week he'd been gone. "Everything's standing," she said. "I can see that," he said. "Aldrin has the photographs. Hester's testimony is formally documented. The federal hearing is in 3 weeks in Helena." She stepped back to let him inside. "Cross is going to make another move before then. I don't know what form it takes." "I know what form it takes," Elias said. She looked at him. He came to the table and put down his saddlebag and took out a folded document. She recognized the format before she could read it. The typeface, the seal, the specific visual language of legal paperwork. "Aldrin intercepted it through his contact in the territorial clerk's office," Elias said. "Cross filed a second action while I was in Helena. He's challenging the validity of the original marriage documentation." Clara felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "On what grounds?" she said flatly. "He's arguing the marriage was contracted under duress and for the purpose of legal manipulation. Specifically, to consolidate property rights in anticipation of litigation." Elias's voice was even. He'd had a week to sit with this, she realized. A week to absorb it. "He's calling it a sham." She picked up the document and read it herself. Cross had been thorough. He'd documented the timeline. The marriage filing 4 days after the federal inspector's visit, the proximity to the wire to Aldrin, the speed of the ceremony. He'd noted the mail-order nature of the original arrangement. He'd characterized Clara as a woman with a personal grievance against Langley, who had entered the territory under the cover of a domestic arrangement for the purpose of prosecuting that grievance, using Elias's land claim as the vehicle. It was, she thought, the most sophisticated lie she'd ever seen. Because it used real facts. Every date, every timing, every circumstance was accurate, and assembled them into a story that was false in every way that actually mattered. "He's very good," she said. "Yes," Elias agreed. "Can Aldrin fight this?" He says yes. He says the argument will be that the validity of the marriage has no bearing on the validity of the land claim or the fraud evidence, because neither depends on Clara's marital status. The documents, the testimony, the photographs, none of it goes away if the marriage is declared invalid. He paused. But Cross knows that. The point isn't to win the motion. The point is to put the marriage under examination, which puts Clara under examination, which gives him the platform to do what he does. Diminish her. Make her small. Turn her from a credible witness into a calculating woman with an agenda. She set the document down. "Aldrin needs a counter-narrative," she said. "Not defensive, not responding to Cross's framing. A counter-narrative that takes the same facts Cross is using and tells the real story." She was thinking while she spoke. "The real story is that I came here with nothing because Langley took everything, that I built something real under impossible conditions, that every decision I made was documented and transparent and driven by the same thing. Trying to survive what Langley did and make sure he couldn't do it again." She looked at Elias. "The real story is not a manipulation, it's a response." Elias was watching her with the full, still attention he gave to things that mattered. "Cross wants to put you on trial," he said, "instead of Langley." "Yes? So we put Langley on trial instead," he said. "Directly. Everything Aldrin has. We stop being careful about the order, and we go in with everything at once." She looked at him. "Aldrin said the same thing," Elias said. "In Helena. He said the time for careful sequencing is over. Federal hearing means federal scrutiny, and the best defense is an offense so complete that Cross spends the entire hearing responding instead of attacking. She exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. "Then we need Ruth." "I know," he said. "Cole talked to Henry?" "Yesterday." She paused. "I don't know yet what Henry decided." They looked at each other across the table, and in the silence between them was the specific quality of two people who have done everything in their power and are waiting for the part they cannot control. "We'll know soon enough," Elias said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not dramatically. Not with any of the gestures that would have felt false for who he was. Just his hand on hers, solid and warm, the same certainty that was in everything he did. She turned her hand over and held on. Ruth Hendricks came to the ranch on Sunday morning. Alone. No Henry. Just Ruth, on horseback, with a saddlebag over one shoulder, and her chin set at the particular angle Clara had come to read as a woman who had made a decision and was committed to it before the conversation started. Clara met her in the yard. "Henry knows I'm here," Ruth said immediately. "I want you to know that. I didn't go behind his back. We talked for 4 hours last night." A pause. "He's not happy, but he understands, and he's not going to stand in my way." Clara felt the weight of that. 4 hours. Whatever Cole had said to Henry, and whatever had happened in the conversation afterward between husband and wife, had taken 4 hours to resolve. "Thank you for telling me," Clara said. "I brought the book," Ruth said, touching the saddlebag. "And the payment ledgers for the last 3 years. Original documents." She looked at Clara steadily. "What do you need me to do?" "Come inside," Clara said. "Elias and I will walk you through everything." They sat at the table for 2 hours. Clara explained the structure of the case, what Aldrin needed, what the federal hearing would look like, what Cross was likely to do. She didn't soften it. Ruth was not a woman who benefited from softened information, and Clara had the sense, from everything she'd observed, that being treated as fully capable of handling the truth was one of the things Ruth Hendricks had been waiting a long time for. Ruth asked questions. Sharp, precise questions that told Clara she'd already been thinking through the implications for a long time. Longer than last night's 4-hour conversation. This was a woman who had been building toward this in her own mind for years. "Cross will go after my credibility," Ruth said. "He'll try," Clara said. "He'll say you have a financial motive, that you're hoping to have your husband's note declared fraudulent so you don't have to pay it." "Do I have a financial motive?" "Yes," Clara said. "Everyone in this case has a financial motive. So does Langley. The question is whether the evidence is credible independent of the motive, and Ruth, your record book is 3 years of contemporaneous documentation. That's not motivated reasoning. That's record keeping." Ruth looked at the book in front of her. "My mother kept records," she said quietly. "Everything she spent, everything that came in, everything that went out. She said a woman who keeps records can't be lied to easily." She paused. "I started the book because of her, not because of Langley." Clara looked at her. "Tell that story," Clara said. "In exactly those words. When Aldrin prepares you for testimony, tell him that." Ruth looked up. Something in her face had settled. The final commitment. The place past the decision where you stop weighing it and simply move. "All right," she said. "Tell me what happens next." The 2 weeks before the Helena hearing moved with the compressed, distorted quality of time under pressure. Some days collapsing into hours, some hours stretching past endurance. Every day marked by something that required a response, a decision, a letter, a wire, a conversation. Cross filed 2 more procedural challenges. Aldrin defeated both, the second with help from Justice Carver's office, moving faster than Cross apparently anticipated. Langley, from everything Clara could read in the shape of the legal activity, had not expected federal involvement to be this decisive. He'd expected local cooperation to slow things down, to give Cross time to build the character case against Clara. Instead, Carver had accelerated the timeline and established federal primacy over the proceedings, which meant Cross was running out of room. And men who run out of room do desperate things. The desperate thing happened 10 days before the hearing, and it came not through lawyers or deputies or manufactured fence complaints, but through Elias's cattle. 18 animals, gone overnight from the north pasture. No broken fence. No tracks that the frozen ground showed clearly. Just gone. Elias's face when he came in from the morning check was something Clara had not seen from him before. Not anger, which she knew, but something older and deeper. The look of a man being worn down by an enemy who keeps finding new ways to take. She stood up immediately. "We document it," she said. "The same way we documented the fence. Right now, before anything else." "Clara." "Right now, Elias." She was already pulling on her coat. "Cole, Bledsoe, anyone who can get here in the next 2 hours. We document and we wire Aldrin before noon." He looked at her. At the coat in her hands. At the complete absence of defeat in her face, even now, even with 18 cattle gone, and the spring sale they needed in jeopardy. Something shifted in his expression, past the old, deep weariness, to something else. "I'll get Cole," he said. They documented it. Cole was there within an hour, and Bledsoe arrived 40 minutes after that with the camera that had already proven its worth once. They recorded every detail of the north pasture, the intact fence, the absence of tracks, the pattern of the absence that told a story about how the animals had been moved rather than scattered. Aldrin received the wire by afternoon. His response came before evening. Documented stock theft with intact fence line and no natural explanation constitutes additional evidence of targeted criminal interference. Bring everything to Helena. This is now part of the main case, not a setback. Evidence. Clara had been afraid that losing the cattle would feel like losing. Instead, it felt like Langley handing them one more piece of documentation of who he was and what he did. "He can't stop himself," Elias said that night, reading Aldrin's response. "He keeps escalating because he doesn't know how to stop. Every move he makes gives us more." "Men like Langley believe that force wins eventually," Clara said. "If you just apply enough pressure for long enough, people break, because that's what's always worked." She paused. "He's never met a situation where the pressure becomes the evidence." Elias looked at her across the table. "Let's go to Helena," he said. "Okay." They rode out 4 days before the hearing. Elias and Clara, Hester Crane, Tom Bledsoe, and Ruth Hendricks, who had arranged for a neighbor to watch the store, and had packed with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who had decided that this was worth whatever it cost. Cole stayed behind to manage the ranch. He sent them off with the specific, unsentimental warmth of a young man who had grown up watching people leave and had learned not to make much of it, which meant, Clara had come to understand, that he felt it deeply. The ride to Helena took 2 days. They stayed at a boarding house Aldrin had arranged, 2 blocks from the federal building where the hearing was scheduled. Aldrin himself came to meet them the first evening. A small, precise man in his late 60s, with sharp eyes behind wire spectacles, and the particular quality of someone who had been very good at his work for a very long time, and knew exactly when he had a case worth fighting. He shook Clara's hand with both of his, and held it for a moment. "Your father," he said, "was one of the finest men I knew in 30 years of practice." She had prepared herself for this. She had told herself the emotion would not hit her in a way she couldn't manage. She managed it. Barely. "He spoke of you too," she said. Aldrin nodded once, pressed her hand, and released it. Then he became entirely professional, which was exactly what she needed. They prepared for 4 hours that evening. Aldrin walked each of them through what Cross would attempt. The line of questioning, the characterizations, the specific vulnerabilities he would target. He was honest about every weakness, and specific about how each would be handled. "For Clara," he said, "Cross will try to make your grief into your motive. He'll suggest that your father's death made you irrational, vindictive. He'll use the personal against the professional." He looked at her steadily. "The answer is always to return to the documents. Every time he pulls toward the personal, you go back to what's written down. The documents don't have feelings. They can't be called vindictive. Let them speak." "And if he asks directly," Clara said, "whether I came here specifically because of Langley?" "Tell the truth," Aldrin said. "Yes, You knew whose territory this was. Yes, you came here with evidence of fraud. Yes, you had personal reasons for doing so. And then you say, the personal reasons are not what make the evidence true. The evidence is true regardless of why I brought it here. He paused. Truth told directly is the hardest thing Cross knows how to fight. She thought of her father saying almost exactly that. I know, she said. The hearing lasted 2 days. Justice Carver was a spare, economical man who listened without expression and wrote continuously, and asked questions that cut so directly to the point that Cross, 3 times, had to visibly regroup before answering. Cross was exactly what Aldrin had described. Smooth, precise, dangerous in the way of something sharp rather than something loud. He moved through the witnesses with patient, confident pressure, looking for the place where each one would give, where the story would crack. Hester Crane did not crack. She sat in front of him with her hands folded and her spine as straight as her fence posts, and answered every question with the blunt precision of a woman who had nothing to apologize for and knew it. When Cross suggested her record book was constructed retroactively, she looked at him with an expression that made 2 of the court observers suppress smiles and said, I have dated entries in 3 different inks corresponding to 3 different pens I owned in sequence, which my husband can verify because he bought each one at the general store in Broken Spur, and the store has purchase records. Would you like those records as well? Cross moved on. Tom Bledsoe's photographs were entered into evidence. Cross challenged their interpretation. Aldrin produced the technical analysis of the cut wire. He'd had a metallurgist examine one of the retrieved samples, a detail Clara had not known about until Aldrin presented it. That confirmed the marks were consistent with wire cutters rather than natural failure. Cross's objection was overruled. Ruth Hendricks testified for almost 3 hours. She was the most powerful witness in the room, and Clara knew it from the moment Ruth sat down and began to speak in the clear, unhurried voice of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to listen. She told the story of her record book. She explained her mother. She walked through 3 years of financial documentation with the specific, unassailable precision of someone who had recorded things not to prove a point, but because her mother had told her a woman who keeps records can't be lied to easily. Cross tried twice to establish that Ruth's testimony was motivated by financial interest. The second time, Ruth looked at him with an expression that Clara would remember for the rest of her life, and said, Mr. Cross, every person in this room has financial interests. Victor Langley's financial interests are what this hearing is about. Mine are what you're asking me about. I'll let Justice Carver decide which set of financial interests requires more scrutiny. Carver actually wrote something longer than usual. Cross moved on. When it was Clara's turn, she sat down across from him with Aldrin's instruction in her mind. Return to the documents, return to the documents, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Calm. Not the performed calm of a woman suppressing fear. The real kind. The kind that comes from having done the work. From knowing that everything she'd needed to say was documented and witnessed, and already entered into the record before she sat down. From understanding that Cross could come at her personally for as long as he wanted, and it would not change a single word of what was written down. He came at her personally for a long time. Her father's company. The debts. The reasons she'd signed with the agency. The timing of the marriage. The motivations, the grievances, the convenient alignment of her personal history with Elias Carter's legal situation. She answered everything directly. She did not apologize for any of it. She did not soften the fact that she'd come here with a purpose, or that the purpose was partly personal, or that she had been angry, was still angry, would probably always be angry, about what Langley had done to her father. And every time Cross pushed toward the personal, she came back to what was written down. Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Carter, she said. The first time. Quietly. A pause. Mrs. Carter, Cross said. You came to Montana with a predetermined conclusion about my client. I came to Montana with evidence, she said. The conclusion follows from the evidence. That's how conclusions work. You had a personal motive. I had a personal loss, she said. The motive is justice. Those aren't the same thing, though I understand why you'd prefer I conflate them. Carver looked up from his notes. Cross shifted. The documents you claim were given to you by your father. The documents given to me by my father, she said, are in evidence. They've been authenticated by your own colleague's review, as noted in Exhibit 14. If you have a question about their content, I'm happy to address it. If you have a question about their authenticity, I'd suggest that ship has sailed. Aldrin, in her peripheral vision, was carefully not smiling. Cross tried 4 more angles. She returned to the documents each time. Patient, unshakable. Not because she was performing unshakability, but because she genuinely was not shaken. She had been shaken once, in a lawyer's office in St. Louis, listening to a man explain that everything her father built was gone. She had been shaken in a train station in Montana, in the mud, with her suitcase broken open and men laughing around her. She was not that woman anymore. Cross finally said, "No further questions," with the flat expression of a man who has not won and knows it. She stood up and walked back to her seat, and Elias, who had been sitting very still through all of it, looked at her when she sat down and said nothing. But his hand found hers under the table and held it, and that was enough. Justice Carver did not make them wait long. His ruling came the following morning, and it was thorough in a way that told Clara he had not slept well either, that he'd spent the night writing something he intended to be read beyond this room, beyond this hearing, beyond Montana. The injunction filed by Cross was dismissed. The Carter land claim was affirmed in full. The evidence of fraud, presented by Aldrin, was referred to the Federal Territorial Court for formal prosecution of Victor Langley and the Broken Spur Land and Banking Company. Carver added, in his written opinion, a section that Aldrin read aloud in the hallway outside the courtroom, his voice steady and precise. The documentation of systematic financial manipulation, corroborated by independent witnesses across multiple properties and over multiple years, demonstrated a pattern of deliberate predation against the residents of the Broken Spur Valley. The federal court would investigate the enforceability of all financial instruments held by the Broken Spur Land and Banking Company under these circumstances. Henry Bledsoe's note, Ruth Hendricks's store debts, Hester Crane's twice refused buyout offers, every string Langley had pulled for years, suddenly visible, suddenly examinable, suddenly subject to the kind of scrutiny that could not be managed by Briggs and a cooperative county court. Hester Crane, standing in that hallway with her record book under her arm, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Walt would have been here if he could," and pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. Clara put her hand on Hester's arm. They stood like that for a moment, in the hallway, while Aldrin finished reading. Tom Bledsoe shook Aldrin's hand twice, unable to speak. Ruth Hendricks looked out the window at the Helena Street and said quietly, "I'm going to tell Henry tonight. He's going to ask me why I didn't do this sooner." She paused. "And I'm going to tell him I did it exactly when I found the right people to do it with." She looked at Clara when she said it. Clara looked back. They rode home in 3 days. The valley looked different when they came through, or maybe it looked exactly the same and she looked different. The same mountains, the same pale winter light, the same road she'd ridden in both directions more times now than she could count. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon. Cole was in the yard when they rode in, and he looked at their faces and knew before anyone said a word. He looked at Elias, then at Clara, and he said, "Done?" "Done," Elias said. Cole exhaled long and slow, like a man releasing something he'd been holding for weeks. "The cattle?" Clara said. "All accounted for," Cole said. 12 came back on their own 2 days after you left. Found them at the East Water, like they just decided to come home. She looked at Elias. He almost smiled. They dismounted, led the horses to the barn, did the work they always did when they came home, the same sequence, the same rhythm, the two of them moving through it the way they'd moved through everything, together, efficient, without needing to narrate it. Inside, Clara stood at the hearth and built up the fire and listened to the cabin settle around her in the particular way it had when the temperature was dropping outside and the warmth was holding inside. Elias came in and sat at the table, and she brought him coffee without being asked, the same gesture he'd been making for her since sometime in the second week when she'd started finding it ready before she knew she needed it. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "What happens now?" he said. She thought about that. "Langley's prosecution takes months," she said. "Possibly longer. Aldrin will handle it. He'll need us available as witnesses, but the heavy lifting is done." She sat down across from him. "The debt note comes due in March. With the federal examination of his financial instruments, Aldrin believes the enforceability is going to be seriously questioned. We may not owe it the way it was written." "And if we do owe it? Then we pay it from the spring sale," she said. "Because the cattle are here, and the claim is clean, and there's no one left to interfere with the operation." He was quiet. "And after that?" he said. She looked at him. At the face she'd been learning for months. The angles of it, the way it held things, the places where it was guarded, and the places where it had learned to be less guarded with her specifically. "We build," she said. "Everything we talked about. The additional grazing land to the north. Bledsoe mentioned the Harmon parcel might come available in the spring, and with the capital from the sale, we could make an offer. And I want to look at the cattle breeding program. There are strains being developed in Texas that are better suited to Montana winters, and if we could establish—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with the unguarded expression. "The real one." "I know," he said. "All of it. The land, the cattle, the breeding program, everything you've been thinking about since the third week." He paused. "I want all of it too." He held her eyes. "I want to ask you something first." "All right," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. It was not a question she had been asked in a very long time. Maybe not since before her father's company started failing, since before the long downward slide that had ended in a lawyer's office in St. Louis, with nothing left. It was the kind of question that required enough safety to answer honestly, and she had not felt safe enough to answer it honestly in years. She felt it now. "Yes," she said, simply, without qualification. Something in his face settled into the permanent version of the expression she'd been watching develop since the first week. The one that didn't have a name, but that meant something real had taken root in the place where there had been nothing before. "Good," he said. Outside, the Montana winter held the ranch in its cold, indifferent hands, the same way it held everything else in this valley, without favor, without mercy, without any interest in the human dramas playing out beneath its vast indifference. But inside the cabin that Clara had learned to keep warm, the fire held. In the years that followed, the valley changed. Victor Langley's federal trial lasted 8 months. He was convicted on 11 counts of financial fraud and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy. The Broken Spur Land and Banking Company was dissolved. Every note it held was reviewed by the federal court, and the majority were found to have been issued under fraudulent conditions and declared unenforceable. Tom Bledsoe paid off his farm within 2 years. He kept the camera. Ruth Hendricks's General Store became the most successful business in Broken Spur. Henry, who had spent 4 hours arguing against his wife's testimony and then never mentioned it again, eventually became Ruth's most vocal advocate in every business decision she made. She told Clara once, years later, that she suspected he'd been secretly relieved all along and just needed someone to give him permission to stop being afraid. Hester Crane lived to see her ranch profitable for the first time in years, with the pressure of Langley's manufactured interference gone, and her fence lines finally left in peace. She came to dinner at the Carter Ranch every Sunday for a decade, and she and Clara talked about things that mattered and many things that didn't, which is the texture of real friendship. Cole Dawson eventually bought the livery outright and expanded it, and when anyone in the valley asked how he'd gotten the capital, he said he'd invested early in something that had very good returns. Harlan Cross never practiced in Montana again. Samuel Reeves, the federal land inspector, who had arrived at the ranch with a leather satchel and a nervous thumb, filed his clean boundary report exactly as Clara had expected. He ran into Elias at the Helena courthouse the year of Langley's trial and shook his hand for a long time without saying much. Some things don't require words. The Carter Ranch grew, not quickly, not dramatically. The way real things grow, season by season, decision by decision, the accumulation of good work done in the right direction. The Harmon parcel came available in the spring, as Bledsoe had suggested, and Clara made an offer that was accepted. The cattle breeding program she'd researched began to show results by the second year. The spring sale of 1886 covered the debt note with enough left over to start the expansion fund. By 1890, the ranch covered land that had once been divided among 3 failing homesteads, all of them purchased fairly, all of them from families who had stayed in the valley because the valley was finally worth staying in. By 1895, the Carter name meant something different in Montana than it had meant when a slight woman in a worn blue dress had stepped off a train in Broken Spur and had her suitcase split open in the mud while men laughed. It meant the largest cattle operation in the county. It meant fair dealing and recorded agreements and a woman who kept meticulous books and a man who knew every inch of his land, and 2 people who had built something real out of the ruins of everything that had been taken from them. People told the story for decades. The version that circulated in the saloons and the general stores and the Sunday dinners of the valley was always slightly different in its details. The number of cattle Langley's men stole, the exact words Clara had said to Harlan Cross, whether Hester Crane had actually threatened someone with the rifle at some point in the proceedings, which was entirely plausible and which Hester neither confirmed nor denied with any consistency. But the core of it never changed. They had sent a man, a broken woman, to ruin him. They had sent her specifically because they believed she was nothing, because she was alone and grieving and arriving with a split suitcase and city shoes and no visible reason to be underestimated. What they had sent him instead was the only person in the territory who understood exactly what Langley was doing, who had the evidence to prove it, who had the intelligence to build the case, and who had the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, but simply keeps moving, keeps working, keeps showing up before dawn and staying past dark, keeps getting back up every time the storm knocks something down. Clara Whitmore Carter never left Montana. She was buried there, decades later, on the hill above the ranch she had built with Elias and with Hester and with Ruth and with Cole and with Tom Bledsoe and his camera, and with every person who had been afraid and chosen to stop being afraid, on the land that had been declared legally and federally and permanently theirs. The worn blue dress was never thrown away. Elias had kept it, folded in the bottom of a cedar chest, without ever explaining why. Clara found it there one afternoon years in and asked him about it, and he said only, "Seemed important to remember," which was the most he ever said about it, and which was, she thought, enough. The woman who had arrived with nothing had built everything, not because she was saved by it, or given it, or rescued into it, but because she decided, standing in the mud of a train platform, with her belongings scattered around her and men laughing in a circle, that she was not going to be the person anyone had decided she was. She was going to be the person she had not yet become. And in the mountains of Montana, where the land is old and the winters are honest, and there is no room for anything that isn't real, she became exactly that.